Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Kill Your Heroes in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Kill Your Heroes. Chapter 1. Pyrophobia. Baptism, or what lurks under bridges. Sakura shadowed Tajuna through the decrepit settlement, feeling disgusted and being ashamed by that disgust. Everything was worn and dirty, from the buildings to the people, and there was a small, alarmed voice in her head shrilling, "Don't touch anything." It was silly, because she'd done her fair share, more than her fair share. She sometimes thought of crawling belly down in questionable-smelling mud, but this wasn't a survival exercise. People lived here every day of their lives, bargaining for vegetables she wouldn't have thrown away without first putting on gloves at home. It wasn't quite squalor, as there was evidence of effort to keep things maintained and having once been prosperous, but it was a tired effort, as wilted as the tops of the carrots on offer. The farmland here was poor, the rivers and winds carrying too much salt for much but the mangroves and buttonwoods to flourish. Once the rivers had offered up fish, the buttonwood a high-grade charcoal, and the pines further inland tar and resin that had been used in local shipbuilding and repair as well as being shipped elsewhere, but when Gato had come, he'd raised the harbors. Now only his ships could travel freely, crippling the trade that had sustained the islands. Most of the families that lived here, the ones that hadn't been able or willing to smuggle themselves elsewhere, were making do with what they could coax into growing and the fish they could no longer sell. It was enough to survive, but it was a life absent of luxury or fiscal security. It was Sakura's first real brush with poverty, and she really didn't like it. Not the sight of it, nor the smell of it, strong enough to make her want to crinkle her nose up in distaste. Damp and fish and tar, nothing at all like home. But she persevered. Mostly. She kept an eye of the children, who'd paused in their play to stare at her. She didn't have much spending money on her, their operating funds doled at the discretion of their Jounin sensei while they were on a mission, but ninja tools were a temptation even to village children who had plenty of actual toys. As they approached the work site, Sakura trailed even further behind the bridge builder. She felt awkward standing on the periphery, but she couldn't exactly help out either, because it was well beyond her current skills to both help and keep a watchful eye on their surroundings. And even if she'd been able to, all her training at the academy had only prepared her for demolishing bridges, not building them. Even that had been limited to a brief mention, as apparently their instructors didn't think adding a working knowledge of serious explosives alongside the myriad of blade objects was a wise decision. So she just sort of hovered, grinding one sandaled foot against the concrete while she eyed their surroundings. They'd covered guard duty quite a bit in class, as it was one of the jobs most often hired out to ninja, but she'd expected a Jounin sensei to be there and instruct her while she was in the field. It was one thing to have run through test scenarios within the grounds of the academy and sometimes in and around the familiar streets of Konoha, but another entirely to actually be guarding someone. Technically, she wasn't supposed to be eligible for solo guard duty until she made Chunin or met certain requirements as a genin and received authorization to do so. But Kakashi sensei was their field commander, so she couldn't exactly argue with him. And, really, when she hadn't had time to think it through, she'd been flattered. Now, however, she was mostly bored. This was her second day of this, but even though it was only morning, she was having flashbacks to how the day before had dragged on and on, the building team working from first light to dusk in order to make as much progress as possible. It meant even taking her midday meal here on the bridge and resigned herself to few and abbreviated bathroom breaks. The only enemy she'd been asked to confront was sleepiness, but she didn't know whether to be grateful for that or not. Tajuna apparently hadn't been completely trusting of Kakashi sensei's less than impressive endorsement of Sakura as a bodyguard, so her pouch contained not only her standard ninja tools but also a few magnesium flares that were bright enough to be seen even through dense fog. Apparently, the residents carried them in case of emergency while fishing, and they did have a certain telltale odor that she hoped wouldn't take up permanent residence in her bag. It was bad enough this town reeked like fish, what would Sasuke-kun think if she did? He might finally notice something, at least, that sour, mood-killing logical part of her brain prompted. As she rushed to reassure herself otherwise, because Sakura had never not achieved something she'd worked hard for, and she'd never worked as hard for something as she did for Sasuke-kun, she did a perimeter sweep. She walked the bridge, peering down into the water, brow creasing as she considered how easy it might be for someone to approach in the heavy fog that wouldn't burn away until well into the day. But it wasn't like she could scale down the bridge's supports and take a look around. Except, she recollected suddenly, she could. It wasn't a tree, true, but the principle would be the same. It might even be easier, since it wouldn't have the same faint buzz of interference as a living tree. Neither Naruto or Sasuke-kun had said anything about it, but given how much more trouble they were having, she had her first real challenge to her assumption that Sasuke-kun had chakra control much finer and more developed than her own. She'd never really been better than Sasuke-kun at anything before, except speaking in Kigo, and she didn't really know how she felt about that. The cry of a passing bird disturbed her reverie and she shook free of her Sasuke-kun crowded thoughts, turning away from her view of the water. It would be fine. Except she hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder. With the view as perfectly obscured as it was and with the supports of the bridge so vulnerable, her mind couldn't help but recall the easy, effortless way that the two Jounin had used the surface of the water as their battlefield. Kakashi-sensei had been certain Zabuza would be too injured to be a threat, but there had been that willowy hunter-nin that wasn't he. And Geto was a rich man who'd already sent one other team to attack them while they were on the road. Rumors said he traveled with bodyguards as well and brought out his thugs whenever the townspeople began to show signs of rallying themselves. No, a lack of personnel wasn't his problem. A cold breeze swept in off the water and made her shiver, though not at the temperature. Sakura suddenly felt very vulnerable and no longer too reassured by Kakashi-sensei's judgment. Now that the possibility had reared its head, she was compelled to check. It was just like the monsters she'd been convinced had lived under her bed as a child. Her parents were completely undistinguished but absolutely dedicated ninja, and after her baba had passed away, she'd spent many nights where she was the only one home. So it had fallen to her to check, as she'd found it impossible to sleep otherwise. This was the same kind of feeling, like something had reached into her chest and was squeezing. But she couldn't turn away, not now. Part of it was because of that old childhood terror, that if she turned her back something terrible might happen. Part of it was that this was her responsibility, given to her by Kakashi-sensei. Sakura didn't shirk tasks assigned to her by her superiors. It just wasn't in her character, even if she approached said task with a deep feeling of trepidation. She scurried over to Tajuna to explain what she was doing, so he wouldn't worry if she disappeared, but really, who was looking after who here, and then she steeled herself to her task. At least with the tree, she'd had the advantage of starting at the bottom. The water looked very solid and very far below from her vantage point. But just like the tree climbing, it came easily to her. The worst part was that despite her feat's ability to defy gravity, her hair and dress wanted to succumb to it, so she had to ignore one and wrestle with the other as she scouted underneath the bridge. Her face burned from more than just the blood rushing to her head. It wasn't as if she wasn't wearing shorts underneath, but still. She decided that tomorrow, since Sasuke-kun wouldn't see her anyway, she would wear something a little more suited to lurking under bridges and change before they returned to Tajuna's home. Not that there was anything particularly interesting to see underneath. Her paranoia turned out to be just that, and she was left feeling both sheepish and a little lightheaded. But when she set out with Tajuna the next day, she wore a dark tank top beneath her dress. She'd never intended to see the light of day. She'd only packed it because she'd heard the mornings in the land of waves would be damp and cool, and she very firmly believed in layering for warmth. Sasuke-kun didn't seem the type to find shivering cute, and no matter what Ino said about shivering burning calories, there were some lines she wouldn't cross. When they had nearly reached the bridge, she ducked behind a building to quickly shuck her dress, folding it carefully and stowing it in her pack. When she emerged, Tajuna had finished giving directions to his crew. As she approached him, she rubbed her hands up and down her exposed arms to generate warmth. "So, keepin' us safe again today?" Tajuna asked in that way of his tone straddling the border between gruff teasing and outright grouchiness. She smiled hesitantly at him, because she honestly wasn't sure which it was. "Yes, sir," she replied. "Well, get to it then," he said, waving her off. She stifled the urge to salute him sarcastically and walked off her perimeter. She glanced askance at barrels of something she'd guessed tar by the smell that had cropped up overnight, along with coils of cotton and rope. She suddenly recalled a conversation she hadn't paid much attention to yesterday. Several of the men on the crew would be leaving in the afternoon, to help other members of the community do some repair and maintenance on their shabby little fishing boats before storm season arrived. Tajuna had been irritated, but grumbled something about understanding the need to eat. When she was satisfied that no one had sabotaged the bridge during the night or set any traps detectable by Genin senses, she gathered herself, pulled her hair up into a knot, and took that first unnerving step off the top of the bridge. Her stomach seemed convinced for a moment she would fall and drown in that mist-covered water, she would die and never get even one date with Sasuke-kun. But she didn't fall and she would win a date with Sasuke-kun. That determined, she took the steps that left her in a world where there was solid concrete beneath her feet, but there was a sea where the sky should have been. Plunging beneath the fog was like walking into a cloud and would have been terrifyingly disorienting if she hadn't had a strong sense of direction. She was certain there was a technique to avoid her blood draining down into her brain, but for now she had to be satisfied with walking quickly toward the pillars situated roughly in the midpoint of the current stretch of bridge, where she could at least be properly upright if she perched on the support beams. It was the ink she noticed first. Chakra-imbued ink, the kind ninja used. And this ink, she understood in an instant as she glimpsed the pair of shinobi kneeling at the center of the construct fiddling with something, was meant to amplify and direct an explosion. The fist around her heart seemed to squeeze tight and Sakura couldn't breathe for a long moment, couldn't think, almost didn't have presence of mind enough to keep her feet firmly planted on the underbelly of the bridge. But then one of them glanced up, his gaze catching hers. Dusky lilac hair framed a handsome face, but there was nothing attractive about his expression. As he uncoiled from his crouch, she saw that there couldn't have been much difference in their age, but the impassive thing that slumbered in those eyes of silver wasn't anything that she'd seen in the eyes of any of her classmates. Almost before she'd noticed him move, he had knives in his hands. Not kunao, knives. They were a design foreign to her with a strange slight curve to the blades, held in a reverse grip at a 45-degree angle to his wrists. She'd seen that grip demonstrated once, though it wasn't part of the standard academy curriculum. The forward movement would leave a gaping slash, the backstroke would rip flesh more messily. Her strange paralysis evaporated and all she could think of was the need to get away, get to somewhere where she could set off her flares, where she wasn't at risk any minute of falling. Sakura sprinted for the edge of the bridge, but she couldn't forget that to misstep was to die, could not lose that single point of contact that kept her from the hungry waters below. That made her slower than she might have been and he almost caught her, surging forward in a powerful bound. It was the sudden absence of pounding footsteps that alerted her to her danger. She did not dodge so much as jerk her body roughly to one side, one hand slapping down against the bridge to keep her balance. She avoided a killing blow, but the blade caught at the edge of her lip and opened up a hot line along her cheek. Adrenaline lent her the speed to stay ahead of the second knife, though the margin was narrow enough that she could feel the blade bite shallowly into her calf as she managed to flip herself around the edge of the bridge and fling herself upward. Her eyes took in her surroundings in an instant and though escape was her overriding thought, others intruded, more by habit than by design. If it weren't for years of conditioning, nothing would have filtered through her panic. As it was, the sight of Tajuna stopped her plans for flight, because he and the others were working steadily at the end of the bridge and the shinobi chasing her wasn't the only threat. Her feet were already moving as her mind desperately sought out something like a plan. Nothing came, but her body moved, running towards town because that was the direction she'd been facing. Her hand fumbled in her pouch for a flare, but a sharp blade rasping over the back of her hand made her drop it, leaving it to skitter uselessly across the bridge. Her hunter still hadn't spoken a single word and somehow his silent, relentless pursuit was almost worse than any taunt he could have made. It made her achingly aware of the fear that rode as a tight knot in her chest, drawing tighter. She had neither Sasuke-kun's speed nor Naruto's stamina at any moment. The chemicals flushing through her veins wouldn't be enough to spur her forward. She lurched suddenly toward the tar barrels, not even thinking, just reacting, and she somehow managed to lift one and pitch it at her pursuer. He was so close as she turned he didn't have room to dodge, just space enough to cross his arms and protect his face. Maybe it was the way her chakra was flaring erratically, maybe it was something else, but the barrel gave with a crunch, tar-heavy, stiff, the heat of the sun not having given it much viscosity yet, but still enough to smear and stick coating his arms in front. There was no conscious thought to it, nothing that could be called a plan, but she saw hesitation, she fumbled for another flare, and then. Magnesium burned at several thousand degrees and could not be extinguished by water, from which it could draw oxygen, which was why these kinds of flares were used only in emergencies and even then with extreme caution on wooden vessels. The flash point of Tar was much lower than that. She'd wanted to hurt him, wanted to keep him from hurting her, but it was a nightmare, this black, boiling stuff eating into his flesh, his clothes catching fire, the smell of scorching skin, the scream that twisted his lips, the knives that were drawing toward her with a heavy sense of inevitability regardless of any of those things. She managed to catch his wrists, ignoring the heat that scalded her palms, squeezing so tight she swore she could feel her own bones creak. He was screaming, but she could hardly hear him, just feel the weight and strength of his body driving his knives on a terrible path. They descended like twin fangs, intent to pay her back in kind for the pain. All that terrible indifference had burned away from those silver eyes and a wild light had replaced it, his features so twisted he hardly even looked human any longer. Whatever miraculous strength she'd had before was gone, now her muscles trembled and she knew that she couldn't hold him off until he died. They had told her that someone would die in fire, they had not warned her that it might take this long. But this one thing she remembered from the academy. She let one arm go limp, sidestepping the knife as his momentum pulled him forward, using that moment to switch the grip on his wrist and drive his other knife on a grating trail and past flesh and bone. He fell forward, still burning, still screaming, still dying, and it was with a terrified, wretched whimper that she scooped up the knife not buried under the corpse. She didn't think to set off another flare for Kakashi-sensei, didn't even in that moment really intend to deal with the other shinobi. Little flecks of boiling tar had leapt to her and like pork frying in a pan, the boiling grease of a human inferno had painted splotches on her shirt. Little flames were trying to gain purchase in the material and they weren't having much success, as the fabric had been treated, but there wasn't enough room for reason when the memory of the burning man was so close. She was on fire and all she could think about was extinguishing it. Sakura nearly threw herself over the edge of the bridge, recalling only in the last moment in her panic that a fall from this height might finish what her silver-eyed hunter had started. She kept seeing those eyes, kept watching his skin boil, even while her eyes could barely focus enough to make out a pillar. She slid more than climbed, her chakra still uncertain, and plunged deep into the cold water. It only replaced one kind of panic with another, because for a moment she couldn't remember how to swim, almost gasped, and drowned herself, but the first touch of water against her teeth was enough to have her sputtering and thrashing toward the surface. It was not a pretty swim and it was only luck that kept her from cutting herself on the knife she had a death grip on. She reached the pillar, clinging to it desperately. "Someone save me," she had space enough to think. "Please, someone save me." But there was no shout of reassurance, no hint of rescue, just a pattern like an ugly black spiderweb stretched across the underbelly of the bridge. And another enemy. She was already coming down hard off her adrenaline high, her muscles quaking, her hair falling down around her face. The cut on her face and on the back of her hand screamed at the salt water and she was still seeing white suns. But there wasn't anyone else. Just Sakura. Kill your heroes. Chapter 2. Basephobia. Sakura clutched at the pillar, her eyes trained on the shinobi high above. She didn't know if she could avoid Throne Kunao from this position. She didn't know if she'd be able to see Throne Kunao. Sakura had closed her eyes instinctively at the first flare of the magnesium, but opened them again just as instinctively in time to meet her enemy's final attack. A still smoldering enemy that she'd left unnervingly close to other flammable objects, but she couldn't think of that. She could barely keep herself together here. Some part of her was relieved when the shinobi who'd continued so carefully mapping out the pattern that would destroy the bridge and everyone on it sneered, turning his back on her in a blatant display of disregard. Sakura honestly wanted nothing more than to keep cowering at the waterline, but beyond the white light of corneal flash burns, she saw a man burning. Her hands shook, but the solid weight of his knife in her hand grounded her. She couldn't let that happen to Tajuna and the others. The fear was great, but the fear of surviving the explosion she would have essentially allowed to happen was greater. Not by much, but enough. She misjudged when she started her ascent up the pillar, her foot coming down on water not nearly as solid as the column, and she barked the skin of one knee and just to the side of one eyebrow. It burned as the salt water seeped into them, but she ground her teeth together and sprinted upward. If she wheezed, so what? It wasn't as if her approach would be any surprise anyway, and she didn't know enough about demolitions to judge from this distance whether he was using a mechanical timer or a chuck repulse type fuse, or how close he was to finishing the inked pattern that would assure that the bridge and everyone on it would be nothing more than rubble and a memory. If he finished before she reached him, if that happened. She shunted away that train of thought. She didn't know how to disarm explosives any more than she knew how to set them. She dug into her pouch for kunai, flinging them at her enemy. Her hands had been shaking, but the cool, familiar feel of the metal loops beneath her fingers brought back the endless conditioning of the academy. She hadn't understood the countless hours of what seemed like mindless practice then, but now she did. Now it didn't matter that her target was a person rather than a painted target. Her body knew this, even if her mind lagged behind. But this target reacted, deflecting her kunai with one of his own. She had some sense that he wasn't nearly as fast as Kakashi-sensei or Zabuza, but that offered her no reassurance. He didn't have to be Jounin level to be better than Sakura, especially at this moment. The white flashes had faded somewhat, but she was still seeing odd shadow lights. She fended off his retaliatory kunai with the knife, but though it sat naturally in her hand, the hilt made for hands not much larger than her own, she was awkward in its use. Sakura had adopted the reverse grip naturally, the hilt and blade formed in such a way as to encourage it, but she'd never defended with a weapon in that position before. One of his kunai rasped along the flat of the blade and traced a shallow path along her arm, and she had to shift herself dramatically to keep from allowing it to continue into the mass of her body. Somehow, though, she couldn't make herself release the weapon she'd snatched up so thoughtlessly. But the exchange of kunai stopped as the gap between them closed, each readying for the other. Sakura simply charged in, but her opponent slipped a scroll from his equipment pouch. And when he unsealed it, it was a weapon unlike anything she'd ever seen. As tall as he was, it was some kind of war club, made of what almost looked like a young tree, the root ball at the end made into a mess of sharpened points and serrated blades driven into the wood. It was not a graceful weapon. It was not a proper ninja weapon, wasn't even a weapon most street thugs might have been satisfied with. But it gave him even more of an advantage in reach, and skin, bone, and muscle had a surprising lack of regard for craftsmanship when faced with enough force. And those blades looked sharp as razors, with a sick, well-oiled gleam. The wood was stained a deep, bloody brown. "Hurry it up, girlie," her opponent grunted, "I don't have all day." Sakura wished she thought she was skilled enough to play for time. As it was, it took everything she had to continue a battle she didn't want to be fighting, all of her will to keep her feet moving forward. Those few, tense seconds when they'd thought Kakashi-sensei was dead had been bad enough. This was worse. Maybe it was because she was alone. She'd expected Sasuke-kun to win, somehow, no matter what had happened to their Jounin-sensei, But thinking stopped as he made his first swing, letting it run out through his hand until he held it like a bat. It was even longer than she'd thought, and she stumbled awkwardly to one side, because if she forgot herself and leaped, that would be the end of it. Like swatting a fly. Even if she somehow managed to block, he was heavier and leverage was on his side. She needed to shift this battle elsewhere. Especially as she wasn't certain how much longer she could keep her feet firmly adhered to the underside of the bridge. Would he follow? That was the thought uppermost in her mind as she tried to keep out of range, being pushed back without much difficulty on his part. His fighting style was as ugly as his weapon, wide swings turning to wild thrusts, but in this battleground and against Sakura, it was proving effective. She chanced a glance behind her, which revealed she'd lost more ground than she'd thought. She was almost at the edge of the bridge, the hook and cable of the dormant lattice boom crane dangling tantalizing far away. Maybe. Her mind was clouded with too much panic to produce something coherent enough to be called a plan, which insinuated more steps and clearer intentions. But she needed to change the battleground. She just needed to survive doing it. She had a lot more shuriken than kunai, and none of them would do her any good if she died here, so she used her supply freely, trying to aim for his feet as they continued their swift, awkward dance. She irritated him, she saw that clearly, and when she finally, with a swift twist of her wrist at the last second and coming dangerously within his range, sent a line of shuriken thudding home, she infuriated him. As he reached down to tug them out, she didn't allow herself to be baited in, instead turning, sprinting, and taking the greatest leap of faith she'd ever attempted. She caught the cable with her free hand and twisted her feet around it. She was immediately glad she'd only had one open hand, because the cable was steel, cutting remorselessly even past her weapon calluses. Using her chakra rather than her grip strength, she slithered upward, her enemy choosing to come up over the side of the bridge and ascend the crane in a series of leaps rather than duplicate her own jump. Sakura had only seconds to catch her breath before they met in combat along the length of the crane's jib. They were both more agile now, something that Sakura felt a deep sense of regret about, when she had the space to feel anything at all. And then it happened. Sakura was tired, her chakra not flowing as effortlessly as it had when the fight began, and there was a moment when her balance was precarious and her control slipped. She barely managed to catch at one of the bars before she fell and she dangled precariously, her one point of contact a hand that was slick with her own blood. Her arm trembled as she fought against gravity and the weight of her own body. No sparring match at the academy had prepared her for this. There had always been the safety net of surrender, now there was only a choice about whether or not to let go. Her opponent seemed eager to hurry her decision. He sneered at her and ground one foot down on her hand, which already had been thoroughly abradged by its encounter with the cable. Sakura screamed, the pain enough to override exhaustion and create an instantaneous reflex. She drove the knife through his ankle. "You bitch." He cursed her, shifting his weight to bring that club down, but she'd already used the momentum caused by her movement to swing herself close enough to grab his other foot with her newly free hand. Her grip was solid around his ankle and she yanked it toward her with everything she had left. His entire weight was on that leg and he was just off balance enough for his foot to slide forward that necessary inch into thin air. Weight and gravity took over where her strength ended and his pelvis met the unyielding steel bar with a solid crunch. He almost pulled her down with him, but she used his trapped body to claw her way up until she was crouched atop the jib. His legs had tangled awkwardly, putting the knife back within reach. Sakura took it. And without any more hesitation, fear spurring her to new quickness, she ended the fight. Once, twice because fear had made her clumsy and she'd misjudged the first stroke, and then it was over. At first she could only stay there and tremble, braced almost as awkwardly as he was tangled, because she couldn't trust her chakra anymore, but then she'd had enough. She wanted these last minutes of her life to have never happened, she wanted to be home and finding herself waking up from a terrible dream, she wanted it to be one of those rare occasions when her parents were home too, but she had to settle for getting down, for getting the workers off this bridge in case she hadn't made it in time and somewhere beneath her feet was a fuse already lit. Sakura moved with excessive care, trying to move quickly without falling, until her world was a rhythm of moving her feet and hands from one brace to the next. When her sandaled feet encountered concrete, it felt very strange. Surreal, really. As she stumbled back toward the work crew, she noticed they'd dumped sand on the other shinobi and soaked it before it could spread. Somehow that made her stare, because it hadn't occurred to her that the civilians might make themselves useful. Tajuna whistled when he saw her battered form and Sakura winced. If she looked half as bad as she felt, she didn't want Sasuke-kun to see her until sometime well after they'd returned to the village. He turned and called over to another worker, "Masa-kun, why don't you get the first aid kit?" He thrust his thumb over his shoulder at the sandy mound of the other ninja's body. "If you want, we can take care of him, but your sensei'll probably want to have a look at him, eh?" "I guess I mean, yes," Sakura said, fumbling with the simply affirmative. Proper protocols seemed so far away. "But we need to get off the bridge. Now." They were setting explosives and I don't know enough about them to disarm it if he managed to set it. Shock crossed Tajuna's features, but it was very brief. He seemed almost less surprised than she had been. In short order, he'd mustered his crew and they'd retreated to a distance Sakura thought was safe while they waited for Kakashi-sensei to arrive. She hadn't noticed, but they'd sent up the flare she'd dropped. And he wasn't as oblivious to his surroundings as she was. "Ah, over here, Masa-kun," Tajuna called. "No point in waiting to get you cleaned up a little," he said to her. "Have a little consideration for those who have to clean your blood off the street." One of the crew members came forward and she allowed herself to be led out of the way, borrowing space on the bench in someone's scraggly front garden. The first aid kit looked more like a repurposed toolkit than anything she was accustomed to and Masa grinned at her. "Sorry. We're a little low-tech when it comes to something short of an emergency. Clean rags to stop the bleeding, alcohol to disinfect, some cold packs. If it needs more than that, it usually means an immediate trip to the clinic anyway. Anything feel like it might need stitches? He asked as he coaxed her to sit. It was a little closer to a collapse, the knife clattering to the road as she finally forced her fingers to let go. She had a flash, instant but overwhelming, of silver eyes creased in rage and pain. She shuddered. Cold? Masa asked. He was perhaps twice her age, with a kind face. Sakura shook her head. No, she croaked. She sat still as Masa tried to carefully shift her hair out of her face, but it was sticking and pulling at her cuts and abrasions. Her headband simply wasn't enough to keep it back after her dip in the sea. Masa tugged free the material that had been binding his own hair out of the way, one of those oversized, fringed things she could never decide if it was a kerchief or a scarf and associated heavily with desert campaigns. Shimik? Something like that. This one was white, with a simple black grid work. She noted absently that his revealed hair was a muddy brown, chin-length, and raggedly cut. Go ahead and tie your hair back with it, he coaxed. It was clean when I put it on this morning. Sakura managed to undo the knot of her forehead protector, replacing her ineffective ribbon with the far more effective shimik. Though Masa had to knot it for her. After fumbling at it and getting in his way, she just sat quietly with her hands tucked in her lap, holding a bundle of rags against the back of her bleeding hand. It wasn't deep, but as was the case with head wounds, there wasn't a lot of flesh to protect the veins and it had been bleeding freely. She was so miserable and sick to her stomach she hardly noticed when he turned his attention to her face. Until he prodded at the cut at the corner of her lip. Ah, this might scar, he said. You might need stitches, too. I'll take you to the clinic when we've finished here. But you're young enough that even if it does, it will fade. Sakura had a feeling that the idea of scarring on her face was something she ought to care about, but the longer she sat still, the more exhaustion pressed down on her. And the more she felt that, if she turned her head, those fierce silver eyes would be watched her. Hunting her. Thinking that he was dead was no comfort, because that brought on a different kind of terror. So she didn't look. Didn't do much of anything, didn't think much of anything, until she heard the murmur of the crowd that heralded Kakashi-sensei's arrival. Before she could even spot him, Tajuna was explaining the situation in a loud, carrying voice. Kakashi-sensei's answer was brief, crisp, and then he was gone again and Sakura was left in suspense with everyone else. It seemed a long, long wait, but then there was a cheerful report of, all clear. Good, then let's get back to work, Tajuna said. Most of the crew members shuffled back to the job site, though Masa stayed with her. She flinched when Kakashi's hand came down in that familiar, condescending head pat. Sakura hunched her shoulders forward. Kakashi-sensei, you're late, she accused. Now that he was here, it was almost a sob. Ah, Kakashi-sensei acknowledged. Sorry about that, Sakura-chan. She huddled closer, drawing in her knees as she sucked in uneven, ragged breaths. She didn't want to cry. Shinobi mustn't. But with the warm, solid weight of Kakashi's hand resting on top her head, it was proving really, really hard. Someone approached them and she didn't bother to look up, but the soft rasp of something being placed on the ground made her glance at it out of habit. She kept looking out of horror. Why would anyone think I would want that? It was the twin to the knife she'd used. But its steel was discolored from the heat, the nylon cord that had wrapped the hilt melted, tar spackling the exposed metal on the hilt. And it was still smeared with the blood of the first man she'd ever killed. Tentatively, she reached out, fingers ghosting over the melted and burned wreck of cord. She turned, Kakashi-sensei's hand falling away. The workers had unearthed her first victim from his grave of wet sand and her gaze skittered away from even the faint glimpse she'd see from this distance, but her eyes caught elsewhere. The morning sun finally burned hot enough to boil away the clouds, turning the sky a fierce red-orange, and there in that fiery sky, cast in dramatic silhouette at near the apex of crane like some kind of gory flag shifting slightly in the breeze was the twisted body of the second. Sakura wept. Kill your heroes. Chapter 3. Somnophobia. Crying didn't bring any kind of relief, Not like sobbing into Ino's arms or her mother's might have, just a sense of being watched, judged, and found wanting. She wasn't crying loudly. Sakura had immediately stifled her sobs into something like harsh, ragged breathing in the way only those children who've learned that crying only attracts more bullies can, swiping furiously at her cheeks with the base of her palms. She had a sense, not necessarily backed by auditory evidence, that the civilians were whispering about her. That same sense told her that Kakashi-sensei was regarding her with disappointment, so she struggled to stop and she was careful not to meet his gaze. But stopping seemed beyond her. It wasn't until her nose started running in earnest that her tears began to taper off and she could rummage in her kit for a tissue, unfolding herself from where she'd pulled her knees tight to her chest. She found one, of course, because Sakura had trained herself to be the kind of girl who never left home without a packet of tissues and a tube of lip gloss. Not even Ino could make a runny nose attractive. When she'd cleaned herself up as best she could, the back of her hand still sluggishly dribbling blood and the cut on her face bleeding more freely, she stared down at the hand the tissue was clenched in. Kakashi-sensei, the words all seemed to catch in her throat. She both wanted and didn't want to talk about what happened. Part of her thought that it would be better to have Kakashi-sensei tell her that everything would be fine, the other part insisted that he wouldn't understand what she was feeling, the painfully acute mix of guilt and relief. And it hurt to talk, not just emotionally, but physically. The wounds which had hurt even in the midst of the fight suddenly seemed much worse now. As her hand came up instinctively to the cut on her face, she noticed that Kakashi-sensei wasn't looming over her as she expected. Instead, he was crouching. Not close enough to crowd her, but close enough to be comforting, somehow. Kakashi-sensei was not necessarily cold, at least not outside of that battle with Zabuza, in which he'd seemed like an almost entirely different person, but he was not a warm person either. "Sakura-chan," he said, almost gentle, "why don't you go with this nice young man and get those treated?" His hands ghosted up toward his face, then flicked toward her to indicate her own wounds. "They look like they hurt. I'll take care of things here for now. We'll talk later, Ne." Sakura nodded shakily and managed to get to her feet, even though her legs trembled and she had a horrible moment where she thought she would collapse to the ground. She saved face by pretending she'd meant to snatch up the knives, but when she found them in her hands, she didn't know what to do with them. She wanted to pitch them to the ground with a screech and go wash her hands, because both were tacky and one was warm, and she wanted to be sick, but instead she just clutched them tighter. If she didn't want to lose to Ino, she at least couldn't be sick in public. Not only her pride as a ninja, but her pride as a woman was at stake. So, taking a deep breath, which did nothing to calm her when it only brought the stench of tar and melted plastic, Sakura allowed herself to be led to the clinic. The doctor was a stocky middle-aged woman who was promptly horrified at her appearance. That just made Sakura feel worse even before the doctor produced needle and thread, but the pinch and sting of having everything cleaned and disinfected helped distract her from replaying what had just happened in her mind. Sakura had listened to all the lessons about compartmentalization and rationalization and all the other coping techniques they'd need as shinobi in the field. She watched the same films, been shown the same pictures, had attended the same demonstrations as the rest of her class. She'd thought she was prepared. No one had ever asked Sakura if she wanted to be a ninja, but she'd never wanted to be anything else, either. It was just what her family did. They weren't like the big clans, the Senju, the Hyuga, or the Uchiha. Neither side had ever fared well in wars, so they were a small family. Her father had lost all 3 siblings and her mother had once had a sister who'd survived the brunt of the fighting only to have her body declared irretrievable after a botched mopping up mission, and they didn't have any distinctive techniques, but they were loyal soldiers of the village. Until now, she'd thought she was ready for this. That she knew what being a shinobi meant. What it meant to take someone else's life. To risk her own life. Again and again and again. She couldn't decide which had been worse, the fight itself or the resolution. She still felt the terror of being chased by a stronger opponent, someone who would ruthlessly cut her down if he could catch her, but she could also feel the heat of the fire beating against her skin. She shuddered and earned a rebuke from the doctor for her trouble. Sakura worked to keep still after that, but what should have been easy with the exhaustion weighing her down became a trial. It was as if sitting still gave the memories time to catch up. She shoved them away, tried to replace them with her favorite fantasies about Sasuke-kun, but they seeped back in, far more sharp-edged and vivid. It was accusing silver eyes that haunted her rather than the dark ones she'd spent so much time hoping to turn her way. But at last it was over. The cut from the edge of her lips along her cheek had required stitches, and though it presently had a bandage covering it, she was very self-conscious about it, prodding the edges of the bandage as she stared at herself in the mirror. The scrape along her eyebrow had been left uncovered and it was an ugly field of developing scabs, but it made something pinch inside her chest to know that her smile would be accented for years with a scar. The doctor had found a hair tie for her, to replace Masa's shimmick, and she ran the well-worn but as he'd promised clean fabric through her hands. She'd used to do the same this with Ino's ribbon, winding and twisting it in her fingers over and over. Once, it had been comforting. Once, the worst thing in her life were playground bullies. Sakura eventually gathered herself enough to emerge from the little bathroom where she'd combed out her hair and tried to offer the scarf back to Masa with her thanks. But he grinned at her as he took it from her hands and looped it playfully around her neck. "A token of appreciation, for saving all of us today," he said. "Here, fold it like this," he suggested, and with deft hands, he refolded and tied it so that it formed a high ridge in front of her face. "And there you have it. It might make that a little less noticeable until it heals. It would be better if the fabric was newer, but I still think it looks cute." Sakura blinked at him, then turned so she could see herself in the mirror. It wasn't high enough to obscure it completely unless she ducked her head, but it did present a kind of visual barrier that diverted focus from the bandage. And for some reason, that lightened her spirits, but what really, almost unreasonably seemed to ease the pressure was the earnest, freely given gratitude in Masa's voice. She'd known that she'd killed people today. It had almost escaped her that she had also saved them. She would never remember exactly what she said to Masa, but whatever it was, she doubted it really conveyed her appreciation. Until that moment, Haruno Sakura had been a kunoichi by happenstance. Now she had something. It wasn't as fully fleshed out as Sasuke-kun's driven ambition, it wasn't as loud or overpowering as Naruto's ninja way, but it was the first fledgling sprout of a reason to do more than simply be. It wasn't a life-changing revelation, not something so big and overwhelming as that, not great enough to wash away all the fear and horror that still clung to her, but it was enough to temper it. It was enough to give her space to breathe again for the moment. It was enough to take her back to the bridge. It was even enough to see her through the rest of the day. It helped that Tajuna and his work crew had recovered admirably. With everyone else acting as if it were business as usual, it was easier to go through the motions as well. Part of her was grateful for this, while another part wanted the whole world to be as shaken as she was. But the latter was weaker and, with a touch to Masa's shimmick for reassurance, she found that the sun still traveled across the sky at the same pace it had this morning. Eventually, it dipped toward the horizon and Tajuna and the others began to gather up their tools. And Sakura spoke to Kakashi-sensei for the first time since she'd returned from the clinic. Why did it take you so long?" she asked in a low voice. Kakashi turned his head to glance down at her. "I had to deal with some annoyances on the road. Gato apparently didn't want to take any chances with survivors making it home." Sakura made a soft, awkward sound of acknowledgement and then fell silent again. That was fair, she conceded when they'd made it almost back to Tajuna's home. Kakashi-sensei was a jounin, not omnipotent. But the closer they came to the house, the more nervous she grew. Her hand kept creeping up to check the fold of the scarf and she began to drag her feet. Despite everything, she didn't want Sasuke-kun to see her like this. She hardly even liked him to see her when she was all flushed and sweaty from practice. Sakura had worked hard never to show him anything but her very best, most composed self. Now not only was she filthy, her hair volumeless and lank, but Naruto was bound to ask questions. And if there was ever a double-edged quality, it was that he didn't know when to quit. Sakura couldn't think of a single moment in her life when she'd less felt like talking to anyone, let alone the blonde irritation. But when they came inside, after she'd dithered outside until Kakashi-sensei gave her a significant glance, she discovered that both of the boys had wolfed down an early dinner and basically collapsed. So there weren't any questions, just worried looks from Tsunami and curious ones from her son, and silence in the room she was sharing with her teammates. Judging by how little Suzuki-kun stirred when she came in after she'd had a chance to shower, both had been exploring their limits. That was something she understood. But even with a physical tiredness that was the equal of most anything she'd ever felt, she wasn't prepared to sleep. So she sat very quietly instead, cleaning the knives that had somehow come home with her. One was easy. She had all sorts of theoretical knowledge on how to get blood out or off of almost anything. The other was more trying. In lots of ways. In the end, she cut away the cord that had once bound the hilt and rubbed it down with a rag generously saturated with mineral spirits, which she had to borrow from Tsunami. There was nothing that could be done about the discoloration. She was still staring at it when Kakashi-sensei came in the room, rubbing at his hair with a towel. He paused for a moment, but said nothing before settling himself comfortably in the doorway that led out onto the narrow veranda, pulling out that battered book of his. For once, she didn't mind. Something in her had come to associate it with an absence of real danger. It was only then that she noticed just how hard it was to keep her eyelids from drifting shut. And how her whole body seemed to be swaying forward when she wasn't paying particular attention. She settled into her futon, but she couldn't bring herself to complete the nightly ritual she'd carried out almost religiously from the moment she'd had an opportunity to spend a night in the same room as Suzuki-kun. Mouthing good night, Suzuki-kun was a giddy little guilty pleasure that made her feel as if her day had gone well, no matter what had happened in it. One day, she was going to say it out loud. And one day, Suzuki-kun was going to say it back. But today was different. She was, somehow, different. So she drifted off to sleep in silence. Kill your heroes. Night terror was a word she'd heard, once or twice. And Sakura, like everyone, had had nightmares in her life. She'd thought she might have nightmares after today. She hadn't expected for sheer fright to rip her up out of sleep, her heart galloping in her chest, her throat muscles seized so tight she couldn't force the scream building in her chest out. Sakura felt like she was burning beneath the heavy blanket, but when she tossed it off, the sudden chill bit at her like a knife. She was disoriented in the darkness of a room that was still strange to her, and she kept seeing movement where there wasn't any. Sakura didn't reach for a kunao after she'd thrown off the blanket. That simple motion had seemed to exhaust her ability to act, all that was left was to sit there and shiver. The room seemed so cold, but then, she'd been burning. Sweet dreams faded like cotton candy on the tongue, but this one dogged her with brutal persistence. This time, the chase had lasted longer. Those silver eyes had pushed her until she'd felt like her lungs would burst, until her throat burned from desperate gasps for air, until her whole side was a twisted cramp like a kunao digging into her side. And she'd just given up, when she could take no more. Collapsed to the ground on her knees, sobbing. And then he'd come. Step by ominous step, each sound unnaturally loud. And this time, it had been her that had burned. It was only a dream didn't have its usual effect. She could only crouch there on her knees and elbows, fingers digging into her hair as her quick, shallow breathing made her lightheaded. She thought she was going to pass out, but then a hand came down gently on her head. A familiar, warm hand. Sakura-chan. That was all. He didn't offer her any more words of comfort than that, but it was enough to stop her from hyperventilating. And he sat with her while the panic eased, until she'd recovered enough to lay back down and curl into an exhausted pillbug position. He had to do it twice more before morning came, but if she woke either Naruto or Suzuki-kun, they never spoke. By her third episode, it was a far less violent awakening and the terror-induced paralysis had shifted to an urgent need to move. Though her body complained of being badly rested, that impulse didn't disappear with the sunlight. It made her jittery, so much so that she was clumsy as a child with her chopsticks. It made her really glad that Suzuki-kun had been absent when she'd finally woken for the last time and Naruto was still snoring so loudly he was audible throughout the house. When she'd finished eating, she looked over at Kakashi-sensei. His visible eye crinkled up in that familiar crescent. "You're with me today, Sakura," he said cheerfully. "Guard duty for the two of us." Sakura brightened at that, though some part of her had known that now that Gato had made it clear he wasn't going to wait for Zabuza to recover, Kakashi-sensei wouldn't be able to entrust her with Tajuna's safety any longer. But hearing him say it was reassuring. She shuffled off to get ready to leave with only the faintest edge of trepidation. The knives were left beneath her pillow. She didn't have sheaths for them and they were too long for her standard kit. And she wasn't certain if she even wanted to ever use them again. But when she considered simply throwing them away, she couldn't do it. It was stupid, because they were only metal. And memories. She'd had no such reservations about her tank top. It had been unceremoniously tossed into the burnable garbage in her red dress, which had been spared the fight, was once again her garment of choice. With Kakashi-sensei there, she doubted she would find herself walking upside down beneath the bridge any longer. Moss's kindly given scarf looked a little strange with it, in a way it hadn't with the tank top, but she wore it regardless. Night seemed far away, Kakashi-sensei was there, and Sasuke-kun hadn't seen her. And when they arrived at the bridge, it was almost as if it had never happened. The bodies were long gone and they'd cleaned up the worst of the mess of tar and sand yesterday. Still, a restlessness plagued her as they patrolled the area. She kept expecting shinobi to coalesce out of the mist. Kakashi-sensei must have noted her restlessness, because once he was satisfied enough to let the work crew onto the bridge to begin their day, he motioned to her to follow. She was surprised when he doubled back from the leading edge of the construction to the shore, where he led her down to the shoreline. They'd reinforced the area with large rocks before beginning construction, but it was easy enough for them to leap from rock to rock. With a new understanding of how her chakra could be used, not even the ones that had a developing layer of sludge were that treacherous. Kakashi-sensei smiled at her when she met him at the bottom, where the sea was lapping gently at the rocks. "It'll probably be a little tedious for you today, if you were just doing guard duty. So, today, we're going to move on to lesson number 2 on basic ninja modes of movement. Water walking. You have all day and plenty of water," he said with an expansive gesture towards the sea. His smile deepened. "I'm sure you already know the theory. And if you don't, you can probably guess. All that's left is practice. Kill your heroes." Chapter 4. Doxophobia. Water walking came to Sakura as instinctively as tree climbing. Perhaps it was because her chakra was weaker than Naruto's or Sasuke-kun's, but after only partial submersions she'd been cautious enough use her new skills to cling to a rock while she got the feel of it. She began to understand how to interface her chakra with the natural flow of water to firm it beneath her feet. By late morning she was strolling cautiously further out into the sea, where the spray wasn't as bad and she didn't have to account for the rolling wavelets. Though she was still taking care, it didn't take so much concentration as to prevent her from scowling down at her dress. It was soaked from the waist down and the panels of wet fabric kept slapping at her legs and clinging. It had been a present from her parents and an expensive one at that. And when it wasn't sopping wet and she wasn't expecting it to defy gravity, it had been a much-loved garment. It was cute and distinctive, combining the feminine with the practical. Or so she'd thought. Maybe if I have it cut down into a top? She considered that possibility and decided that might be the best course. She'd liked the way the skirt had helped to take attention from the fact she didn't have hips to speak of yet, so if she bought a shorter overskirt. Her thoughts trailed off. Usually the thought of shopping would have eked away the restless irritation that had been building as she dealt with her dress's limitations, but today it remained a hard, stubborn knot in her chest. She turned her gaze back to the shore and found she'd come further than she'd thought. Though water walking was more taxing than a stroll in her yard, it wasn't so chakra-intensive she was in any danger of having to swim back for hours yet. But it was hard to explain, even to herself, a fierce need to move. Changing the way her chakra was keeping the water a solid surface beneath her feet, she allowed it to gain a consistency less like flooring and more like mud. Shifting her weight forward, the water welled behind her heels like nature's own sprinter's blocks. There was a moment where she firmed the surface tension and then she was off like a bird that had caught sight of a cat. She ignored her breathing in favor of turning her attention to her feet, in not only keeping the water firm, but in also getting that perfect angle to build her momentum. In throwing all her weight forward against what was essentially an endless series of starting blocks, she was suddenly going faster than she'd ever managed on land. The rocks came up quicker than she anticipated, the steep slope of them like someone had dropped a wall in her path, but a sudden fit of daring meant she didn't slow. Instead she used momentum rather than chakra to scale it as high as she could, and at the very apex, she succumbed to lapel du vide. She shoved off, giving it everything she had so she'd be clear of the rocks. Everything, including chakra. It was instinctive, thoughtless. Bad. Because suddenly she was flying blindly backward in a much higher arc than she'd planned, and surprise and more than a little fear slowed her reactions. She didn't flip herself over in time, so she came down with hands outstretched rather than landing feet first. Sakura panicked, focusing so much on making the water solid that she didn't even consider that without a working knowledge of how to reinforce her wrists with chakra, the impact was going to be much worse than if she'd simply turned it into a dive. The first hand to come down gave with an ugly twinge and she toppled sideways, the water rushing up to meet her like a slap from the hand of a god. The impact drove all the breath from her lungs, and when she gasped desperately for air, she inhaled water instead. Some sense of self-preservation managed to pierce the cloud of drowning that occupied the higher centers of her brain. She thrashed gracelessly to the surface, coughing violently, and it was only after several minutes of treading water awkwardly that she remembered she'd mastered water walking. She dragged herself out of the water, wincing as her wrist protested. Her entire side felt like it was going to bruise. Sakura was still occupied in retching up the rest of the water when she became aware of Kakashi-sensei. Or, rather, Kakashi-sensei's sandaled feet, which appeared in her currently limited line of vision and were as a matter of course connected to the rest of him. While an impressive display of aerial acrobatics, Sakura-chan, he drawled, you might have been getting ahead of yourself a little there. Is your wrist all right? Sakura flexed her fingers, then tightened them into a fist. She was aware that she was lucky she could have broken it. Instead, she was left with what felt like nothing more than a painful sprain. Yes, sensei, she whispered. She drew herself slowly to her feet, good hand clasped over her aching wrist. She chanced a glance up from under her lashes at Kakashi-sensei, bracing herself for a scolding. But his expression didn't hint at anger. If anything, he looked a little bemused. She was still adjusting to his ability to be so expressive with so little of his face visible, but she didn't think she was misinterpreting it. Seeing her attention on him, he chuckled and ran his hand through his peculiar silver hair. It was some very impressive chakra control. Even at the end, though you might not think so. But let's get you to the clinic. You might have pulled your stitches. Sakura tentatively reached up to check her bandage and her fingers came away a watery pink. I wasn't supposed to get it wet, she said blankly, only now recalling that admonishment. Ah, Kakashi-sensei said in acknowledgement. Well, there is a long tradition among shinobi of doing things against medical advice. Sakura nodded dumbly and began the stiff, uncomfortable walk to the clinic. She was somewhat surprised to find Kakashi-sensei accompanying her, but the clinic was much closer than Tajuna-san's home, and by this point, Gato would know that the bridge builder was no longer being guarded by a single genin. There at the end, Kakashi-sensei said casually, do you remember what you did? Used chakra, Sakura muttered. Correct, he replied with audible amusement. But do you remember how you used it? Sakura was made newly aware of how sore her face was as she considered it. She remembered the impulse, but any specifics had been lost in the wash of fear that followed. Sakura shook her head. Ah. Well. Sakura glanced over at him. Did I do something wrong, Kakashi-sensei? To her, the answer was clearly yes, but she was still waiting for his criticism. More unexpected than wrong. We'll work on it. Even with your landing, I think it's safe to say you've got the basics of water walking down. Naruto and Sasuke will be jealous, any. Sakura winced, remembering that brief flash of antagonism from both boys when Kakashi-sensei had used her example to bait them. She didn't care what Naruto thought about her. But she cared deeply what Sasuke-kun thought. She didn't want to be his rival. She wanted to be his girlfriend. Kakashi-sensei apparently interpreted her less than friendly glance correctly, for he held up his hands in appeasement. Ma, no need to look so unfriendly. They lapsed into an uncomfortable silence. Or, at least, Sakura felt uncomfortable. Kakashi-sensei was reading again, which made it hard to gauge his mood. That was not the case for the doctor, who was naturally outraged. Sakura just hunkered down and waited it out. It wasn't as if she wanted worse scarring or complications, but the acid tongue she might have turned on Naruto and the other idiots her own age just sort of withered in the face of adult anger. So it was a thoroughly miserable Sakura that exited the clinic, holding an ice pack to her wrist. It was only a sprain and a relatively minor one at that, but it was yet another discomfort added to a growing list. It and the shock were bad enough that nausea lay curled like a sleeping snake in her belly. Not enough to actually throw up, just enough to make her feel miserable. And she was soaked again. Sakura struggled not to cry. She'd cried after, and that had been bad enough. Crying just because she didn't feel well was something babies did. So she gritted her teeth and spent the rest of the day stalking patterns beneath the bridge, blaming any dampness on her cheeks from the spray. She'd tried jogging, but while she didn't have any visible bruises forming yet, she'd hit the water hard enough that it hurt. Movement kept her muscles from stiffening and gave her something to do that wasn't reliving those long moments in the air. The anticipation of impact had been eerily reminiscent of the day before, that same hyper-awareness of time, each second long and distinct, like the heartbeat thudding in her ears. The world had shrunk to a tiny sphere of "I don't want to die," the fear louder than any other sound. Sakura clutched at her upper arm with her good hand and walked faster. The day eventually burned itself out and she could go back to Tajunas. Sakura was both eager to be away from the bridge and dreading the moment when she would be expected to sleep. The only thing that made the prospect of oncoming night tolerable was Sasuke-kun, and she was in almost as sorry a state today as she was yesterday. But Sasuke-kun wasn't there. Neither was Naruto. Neither had returned for dinner, which was enough cause for concern that Kakashi-sensei went to check on them, only to report that they'd almost mastered the tree-climbing exercise and to let them be. With a sourness that had never before marred her thoughts on Sasuke-kun, she wondered why he was taking so long to master something that was far less difficult than his fire ninjutsu. Once she'd helped Tsunami do the dishes from their evening meal and showered, taking care not to get the bandage on her face wet, there was nothing to do but sit with Kakashi-sensei in their shared room and begin the long, tedious process of cleaning and oiling her weapons, since they'd taken just as much of a soaking as she had. Her mood grew darker with the sky. But it wasn't until Kakashi-sensei said offhandedly, "If you polish that kunao anymore, you'll be able to use it for a signal mirror," that she'd been mindlessly working on the same kunao for the better part of an hour. She set it carefully on the ground in front of her, staring down at its sharp-edged, practical form. "Kakashi-sensei, have you ever thought about why you're a shinobi?" Kakashi-sensei made a thoughtful noise, which he followed with a long silence. Sakura was beginning to think he wouldn't answer, when he finally spoke. "No. But I don't know how to be anything else, so it's not a particularly difficult question." Sakura mulled that answer, which was about as unsatisfying as every other response he'd ever given about himself. Does it get better?" "The fear," she clarified. He sighed very softly and put his book away. "For some, yes. For others, no. It doesn't. There isn't any sort of rulebook or protocol for that, Sakura-chan. How you deal with the fear is something you decide yourself." She drew her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. "What if," she said in a low whisper, "what if there are more of them next time? What if they're stronger than I am? I can't stop thinking about it. Can't stop dreaming about it," she said, voice breaking. "Sakura," Kakashi-sensei said, his voice firm without being harsh, "stand up." Confused, Sakura did as she was told, following him obediently outside. The moon was just cresting the treeline, full and heavy, casting long shadows that turned the familiar landscape into something strange and alien. When he'd led her away from the house, stopping at the edge of the forest, he turned to face her. It might have been intentional or it might have been coincidence, but a bold slash of shadow obscured the visible portion of his face, erasing most of his expression. And in that moment, Kakashi-senpai seemed just as strange and alien as the rest of the landscape. "Sakura, have you ever thought about why you were assigned to this squad?" he asked in an echo of her earlier question. "Iruka-sensei said it had to do with our grades," Sakura answered hesitantly. "Or, more specifically, Sasuke-kun and Naruto's grades." She couldn't remember if hers had even been implied in that discussion. Usually she had excellent recall, but that day had contained several very distressing incidents. And the other squads, were they also assigned using that criteria? Sakura hesitated, because she'd never considered it, but it couldn't be. Most scores were publicly announced in order to encourage competition, but Sasuke-kun had been the only shinobi to have such high scores in almost every area, and Naruto had been, well, Naruto. Everyone else had fallen into a more normal range, performing well in some areas and worse in others. No. She'd made it a question. Kakashi-sensei's answer was more straightforward. No. Every squad, including those who failed and were sent back to the academy, were carefully assessed and selected in order to meet a need of the village. Asuma's team will specialize in intelligence. Their placement was almost guaranteed, given how successful past squads formed from their families have been. Kurene's team will specialize in tracking. Now, and there was a slightly mocking edge to the word, what do you think Team 7's designation is? Sakura flinched, but considered her teammates, not just as she'd known them in the academy, but what she'd learned about them since. Her eyes flicked over to the man who'd been designated as their sensei. Something uncomfortable settled in her chest, and she felt even more isolated than the events of the last few days had managed to make her feel. Because if she left herself out of the equation, it was obvious. Combat, she said softly. Team 7 is a combat squad. But He lifted one hand in a sharp gesture that severed the uncertain trail of her words. In the harsh moonlight, he was a stranger, a sharp, slim curve like an unfriendly smile. You, he said, were assessed to be a genjutsu type. Even in the academy, you should have been aware that they're rarer than either the ninjutsu or taijutsu type. Were you ever curious why you weren't assigned to someone like Kurene? Sakura shook her head. She'd been assigned to a squad with Sasuke-kun, which had been her goal. Why would she have questioned that? Ah. It was a sharp, weighty syllable. Did you know that tree climbing used to be taught in the academy? Now it's not even discussed as a theoretical technique, to keep overconfident students from trying it unsupervised, but once it was used to measure a student's aptitude for controlling their chakra. Chakra capacity is relatively easy to gauge, while control is much harder to assess. It is only once a student is capable of tree walking that they were considered to have the control necessary to learn a wide range of functional jutsu. Can you guess why this might have been important? Sakura wasn't used to not having the answers a teacher demanded of her. It unsettled her, made her nervous. But she could only shake her head. Because war is a beast with an undiscerning diet and every village struggles to feed it. Once, candidates with advanced chakra control were shunted into classes designed to see them on the field as soon as possible. Think of it, and his voice was light and sharp, as a race to manufacture weapons. Not all the potential in the world is useful if couldn't be utilized, so those students who could mold their chakra were put on the front lines to buy more time to train those whose chakra systems stabilized later. Sasuke has middling chakra control. What you're seeing in his training is very close to the average. You, on the other hand, could tree climb after a single demonstration. You learned to water walk in a single morning. You, and this time the pronoun stabbed at her, would have found yourself on a battlefield far, far sooner than 11 if you had been born in time to see that last war. Sooner than either Sasuke or Naruto. You would not have been ready, but if you had survived, your reward would be a field promotion to Chunin. And then there wouldn't ever be a Jounin sensei there to save you. Sakura was trembling. She clenched her fists and tried to breathe through her mouth, but it didn't help. It was as if the ominous, terrible weight of Kakashi-sensei's words were weighing her down like stones pressing on her chest, each sentence bringing it closer to collapsing beneath the strain. That is what real fear is, Sakura, he said. And like the sun coming out from behind stormy clouds, Kakashi-sensei stepped forward into the moonlight and all that terrible pressure vanished. She collapsed, gasping, and flinched back from his hand when he extended it to her. But he only brought it down in that familiar head pat. You already know what it feels like. If you want to fight it, it does help if the skill gap favors you. This time, our enemies are mostly thugs who were never ninja or missing nin who, for one reason or another, never made it past genin rank. That means that on the whole, they're undisciplined. Which will make them more susceptible to what I'm about to teach you. What? How to turn fear into a weapon. And the reason no combat squad was ever formed without a genjutsu type in it. You don't have enough chakra or experience yet to make use of a lot of jutsu, but the Magen, Narakumi no Jutsu should be well within your abilities. It's the same jutsu I used against you the day of the bell test. Sakura cringed as the image of a bloodied and broken Sasuke-kun flickered across her memory. An expert can use it to intensify the body's natural reaction to fear until your opponent hyperventilates. You aren't strong enough to cause anyone to collapse, but if you're outnumbered, it will give you time to get away. And then, he said more affectionately, Sensei can come rushing in to save you. Sakura wished she could go back to the time when she would have wholeheartedly believed that. But what he was offering was much better than nothing. So she focused all her considerable skills of analysis and memorization on this one jutsu, painstaking repeating the hand signs that Kakashi-sensei demonstrated to her until she could link them into a smooth chain. It was only then she cautiously began to channel chakra, committing to memory the way each sign helped to direct and manipulate it. It was harder than the water walking, slightly less intuitive, but by the time the moon was staring down at them from where it had crested in the sky, she was rewarded with her first flicker of something. It was like a haze that had given her the briefest impression of a crumpled form in front of Kakashi-sensei before he dispelled it with a single hand sign. "Good job, Sakura-chan," he congratulated her. "It's your first time seeing the ghost." The ghost? She had quizzically, letting her hands fall to the sides. She felt a sense of satisfaction that was more peaceful than triumphant, but also like she would need another shower before she crawled back into her futon and collapsed. Even being as careful as possible with her chakra, she'd spent a lot on failed attempts. And it had been a long set of days. It's what genjutsu specialists call the image they see when they use a genjutsu. It's a reflection of what your opponent is seeing, superimposed over the real environment. It would be dangerous if you couldn't see both, Kakashi-sensei grinned at her. And her answering smile might have been a bit tremulous, but it was present. She didn't think she was so tired that she wouldn't dream, nor did she think that the dreams would vanish, but she thought she had courage enough now to make it through the night. Maybe not tomorrow, or the nights that would come after, but tonight Kakashi-sensei would keep her safe from everything but her dreams. And those she had to learn to face herself. She woke only twice, briefly, before drifting back into exhausted slumber. She never even noticed when Sasuke returned, smug and fresh from the triumph of mastering the tree-climbing exercise. Kill Your Heroes. Chapter 5. Thanatophobia, Part I. Sakura was very stiff when she rose from her futon, but it was more inconvenient than actively painful. Between her stitches and scabs, the faint twinge of her wrist as she'd pushed herself upright was more minor than the indescribable sound of Naruto's snoring. She'd woken some time before dawn, not quite rested but fairly certain she was incapable of falling back asleep. Especially as someone seemed to have installed a sawmill in the room while she'd been sleeping. So she'd lain there, staring at the wall and watching as the quality of light slowly shifted. She was somewhat resentful of the fact that Naruto's body, splayed out in ungainly fashion, prevented her from rolling over to pass the time by staring at Sasuke-kun. She usually slept in the middle, but as she'd went to sleep alone except for Kakashi-sensei, she'd dragged her futon closer to the wall before collapsing into it. She hadn't even noticed when the others had come in, though when she'd woken in the night she was pretty certain that Naruto hadn't been there. So he'd come in very late, which was good for the sleep quality of everyone else. Sakura had battled restlessness for what was probably the better part of an hour before her need to move overcame the desire to pretend that there wasn't another day at the bridge waiting for her. It was more the need to use the restroom that decided her than anything else. And since she was up, she ran through her morning routine, which made her feel reasonably human again, especially when she stepped outside on the veranda after she'd finished dressing and spent some time stretching. By the time she came back inside, Tsunami was up and fixing breakfast and Kakashi-sensei was sprawled at the table. Openly reading porn so early in the morning at someone else's house made her want to smack him, but she was distracted by the other person at the table. It had only been a few days, but now it seemed like it had been much longer since she'd last seen Sasuke-kun. She was so excited that she almost forgot such things as the rough patch of scabbing next to her eyebrow or the bandage covering her stitches, but when Sasuke-kun glanced over at her and his eyes widened, it all came rushing back. She ducked her chin, hiding behind the barrier of the shimmick, which was proving itself to be a much more useful article of clothing than her red dress. "Good morning, Sasuke-kun," she mumbled into the cloth as she took her seat. And immediately regretted it, because she could have went to help Tsunami, which wouldn't have left her open to Suzuki-kun's scrutiny. His open surprise soon vanished as he mastered his expression, but it was still there in the tone of his voice as he asked, "Did something happen, Sakura?" She blushed a little that he cared to ask and opened her mouth to tell him. No words came. She was surprised and tried again, but even as she searched, there was absolutely nothing about that day she wanted to tell him. Because to tell him would be to relieve it, and she did that enough in dreams. Sakura did not want to bring that fear, that blood, and death and pain, into this room. Not where they ate their meals. Not in a well-worn house with a family that loved each other deeply, one of whom was looking to her curiously and one that looked on knowingly. "It's nothing," she said faintly. "I was just clumsy." Suzuki-kun didn't look like he believed her, but it wasn't in his character to have an argument over the breakfast table over someone else's well-being. Though a not too deeply buried part of her wanted him to. Instead she had to settle for glancing over at Kakashi-sensei, who gave her an encouraging, eye-creasing smile. "So," he began, redirecting the attention at the table toward himself, "I think we should let Naruto sleep in, but I think it's about time you joined us on guard duty, Suzuki. Kill your heroes." Suzuki-kun was here, but so was the fog. It was heavier than usual, but that seemed to please Tazuna. She discovered why when they reached the bridge and found the rest of the crew already assembled. They were all grinning and elbowing each other like boys with a secret, which made Sakura curious, despite the fog putting her on edge. One hand crept up to clutch at her upper arm and her breathing grew a little shallower, but she told herself that it was silly to panic while Kakashi-sensei and Suzuki-kun were here. She even almost believed it. While Kakashi-sensei went to sweep the bridge, she and Suzuki-kun were left to wait with the others. Masa took the opportunity to approach them. She saw he'd replaced his scarf, his rough-cut brown hair now kept back by a more colorful shimok in blue and black. "Morning, Sakura-chan," he said, grinning at her. "And Sakura-chan's friend." Sakura automatically returned the greeting, while Suzuki-kun grunted a reply. "What's everyone so excited about?" she asked. Masa's grin widened. "Today's delivery day and we've got a good, heavy fog, which means we don't have to rush as much." "Delivery day?" Just then, Kakashi-sensei gave the all-clear. "Come on," Masa said, "you'll see." He and the others moved forward, laughing softly, and pulling on gloves. Rather than moving to their usual jobs, two of them immediately went to work getting the sometimes contrary engine of the crane running smoothly, while the others clustered near one edge of the bridge. Masa waved them over and Sakura went, Suzuki-kun trailing silently behind. When she reached the edge, she glanced down, expecting to see fog-shrouded sea, and was surprised to see instead a large barge sitting very low in the water. Its crew was moving with practiced industry in stripping tarps from materials for the bridge. She didn't recognize most of them, but Masa leaned over and explained that their bridge was a continuous multi-span beam bridge, which they were building one span at a time. As this last span had been finished successfully, they would have to construct new cofferdams to build the next set of piers. They already had the sheet piling and other equipment for the cofferdams hidden in warehouses, but the barge was bringing in new rebar, cement, and aggregate, as well as the pressed concrete beams that needed to be cast off-site. All of it had to be smuggled in from the mainland, which not only put them at risk of discovery by Geto, but slowed the building process considerably. Sakura listened politely, if not particularly attentively, but it was a subject that Masa was obviously knowledgeable about. When she commented on it, he laughed, but he was soon hailed away by one of his crewmates and Sakura was left alone with Suzuki-kun. She could think of many scenarios in which being left alone with Suzuki-kun was a lot more appealing. Ones that didn't involve a heavy fog bank that her imagination kept conjuring movement in. And where Suzuki-kun wasn't eyeing her suspiciously every time her hand flinched toward her kunao pouch. She ducked her chin beneath the barrier of her shimok and laced her fingers together, though doing the latter made her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with Suzuki-kun's presence. It wasn't this bad yesterday, she thought desperately to herself. But yesterday hadn't been so foggy and they hadn't been smuggling supplies in right under Geto's nose. And this is why they couldn't afford to commission the village properly, Kakashi-sensei's low, mellow voice observed. Smuggling tends to be expensive and building a bridge this size isn't cheap to begin with. Sakura nodded and Sasuke-kun made that characteristic HN of acknowledgement. And that was the end of conversation for a time, because somehow she couldn't bring herself to try to inveigle Sasuke-kun into discussion. Every topic that she thought might interest him just sort of fell flat even while she was trying to frame it in her mind. It might have been because she kept getting distracted, because she wasn't quite capable enough to keep track of all the movement around her and sound halfway witty. Her Kunoichi class teachers would have been very disappointed. More rebar and cement than she'd ever seen in her life had already been unloaded onto the bridge and whisked away to be secured elsewhere, the barge rising up out of the water as several tons of material were removed. It was impressively efficient, even from the perspective of a ninja, and Sakura was beginning to think that it would all go smoothly when the fog began to thicken. Unnaturally quickly. Her hand dipped into her pouch for a kunao even before she heard Kakashi-sensei's controlled demand. "Everyone off the bridge," he ordered, loud enough to be heard but without even a hint of the panic she was feeling. "Except you, Tajuna. You should stay close." The crane operator, who'd hoisted one of the huge pressed concrete beams about halfway up, hovered uncertainly for a moment before Kakashi-sensei told him sharply to leave it. And he did, sprinting away toward the shore, the fog swallowing him as it continued to thicken. Soon, it was thick enough that it gave a feeling of complete isolation, like they'd been stranded on an island with an unfriendly barrier sea. She couldn't tell if the muffling quality of the fog was psychological or a component of the jutsu, but the sounds of the settlement had vanished. Her grip on her kunao tightened and she had a strange, irrelevant wish that it was the knife. It had already proven itself, which might have made her feel like she'd already proven herself. Not that it would have offered much comfort. She might be unnerved by the cloaking properties of natural fog, might forever associate it with glancing down over the side of a bridge and making a decision that would change her life forever, but this kind of fog heralded a demon. And when he came, it was from the direction of the shore, cutting off any easy retreat back to land. This bridge, which she had already learned was a brutal battleground, would be the stage on which this little human drama was decided. Sakura shuddered, her palm clammy against the wrapped hilt of her kunao, but she shifted her center of gravity so she'd be better prepared to meet a strike. "Sorry to have kept you waiting, Kakashi," Zabuza's voice said, piercing the watchful silence. "I see you've still got those brats with you. Still trembling, poor thing." At first, Sakura thought he was talking about her, but it was her breathing that was too rapid, not her hand that was unsteady. It was only when Sasuke-kun shifted that she remembered Zabuza taunting him at their first meeting. And then Zabuza was there, all around them, but on Kakashi-sensei's word, Sasuke cut them all down. Her heart fluttered a little in something other than fear at Sasuke-kun's display of raw skill, which was nothing at all like the crude, vicious battle she'd engaged in only days ago. It was like comparing the powerful flight of an eagle to the ungainly path of a bumblebee. Fresh pride at being on Sasuke-kun's team flooded her, but it was washed away with a fit of nervous worry when Zabuza marked him out as a target to the false hunternin that accompanied him. But she did what she was supposed to and held her ground next to Tajuna as two distinct battles formed. Even when it was clear that that gap of skill Kakashi-sensei had talked about was in the ninja named Haku's favor. "Is he gonna be alright?" Tajuna asked her in a low voice. "He's my teammate," Sakura whispered, voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I have to trust him." And it was a hard thing to do, but all her training at the academy clearly indicated her role in this scenario. It was Tajuna whom they'd been paid to protect. If he was hit by a stray kunao from either battle, if he died, the outcome of either of these battles would become irrelevant. Not just from a mission failure perspective, but she'd come to understand in these last few days that it was his knowledge and determination that were just as important in getting this bridge built as all the materials put together. If he died, it was Gato's win. So she kept herself watchful, because the demon of the mist and Kakashi-sensei were matched too evenly. If Zabuza managed to entrap him again, even if only briefly, he would cut through her to get to Tajuna. Sakura knew her duty, had no wish for Tajuna dead and these people left under Gato's thumb, but it was equally the deep-rooted sense of self-preservation that made her hyper-aware of her surroundings. And it was paranoia, that sense of being hunted that haunted her with quicksilver eyes, that made her suspect attack from everywhere. It was an almost unsustainable level of tension, broken only once at Naruto's arrival. Welcome as it was, given Sasuke-kun's difficulties, he still somehow managed to make it obnoxious, but she was wound too tightly to trust the turn of battle. When shadows began to resolve into an entire crowd of people at the end of the bridge, there was a moment self-satisfied recognition. She had expected the worst and it had happened, and there was a strange kind of relief in that before she was forced to confront the reality that Gato hadn't trusted that this grudge match wouldn't end the same way the first encounter had. And she was in a terrible position from which to admire his determination to have things sort themselves out his way. Haku and his bloodline limit had closed the escape to land. Kakashi-sensei and Zabuza's fierce battle would make maneuvering around them on the bridge almost impossible, and now there were more thugs and missing nin than were easily counted gathered at the end of the bridge like a pack of predatory animals waiting to scent weakness. She had only seconds to decide what she was going to do, and her only certainty was that she didn't want to be trapped on the bridge. And she couldn't leave Tajuna. She could retreat beneath the bridge and make for the shore from there, but Tajuna was at least twice her weight in height, maybe more. If they died from a fall from the underside of the bridge because she had no practice at all carrying a load that heavy while upside down and clinging tenaciously with her chakra, that would be better than being stabbed to death, but it wasn't the kind of better she was hoping for. She needed to remove herself and Tajuna from the field. Sakura understood Kakashi-sensei's decision to keep him there, preventing Zabuza from sending his hunter after him while he stalled Team 7, but that had changed with the arrival of Gato's men. And if she couldn't go under, she would have to go down. If she could bear Tajuna's weight long enough to stop them from falling, she might be able to get them to the barge. If they hadn't boarded it. Even if they had, she could have Tajuna tread water near one of the piers. Surely not all of them would be able to water walk. The only difficulty there lay in an entire crowd of hostiles between herself and her goal, because at the moment a ninja from the Bloody Mist was between them and the nearest pier in the other direction, but imprinted on her memory were Kakashi-sensei's words. They were only thugs and genin who'd left their villages. Some part of her mind insisted that she was only a genin and there was only one of her and there was no way that this could work, but if there were other choices, she couldn't see them. "Stay close to me," she told Tajuna in a voice made fierce by fear. Sheathing her kunao, she took one long breath, risked squeezing her eyes closed for just a moment, because she didn't want to be here, wanted to pretend she was somewhere else where she'd never even heard of Gato. And then she opened her eyes. Because she was here. Her fingers flexed easily through the sequence of seals that she'd painstakingly committed to memory. Magen, Narakumi no Jutsu. On the last seal of the sequence, she felt a heavy, sick sense of doubt plague her. There were so many, but then she felt the enormous draw on her chakra. She watched as eyes lost focus and jaws went slack, the better part of the crowd caught within the grasp of her technique. When the first man screamed, she grabbed Tajuna's wrist and bolted forward with the older man in tow. She hadn't caught everyone, but she'd caused chaos enough to give her a few precious seconds. Some of those aware were concerned about their comrades, some about a trap that they couldn't see, but Sakura didn't care. When she was close enough, she risked drawing close to the rail to look for the barge. But all that met her eyes was empty water where the barge had been and a gleaming yacht that couldn't belong to anyone but Gato. She stumbled and almost came to a full stop, but she was less than 10 steps from the nearest enemy. Her eyes caught on the concrete beam, still suspended in midair. If Sakura swept Tajuna up across her shoulders with a grunt of effort before he had time to protest. His weight limited her badly, but somehow she made it up on the rail and she threw herself forward into a sprint. If she wobbled, she would fall, but somehow her feet kept to the narrow path. One of the thugs lunged toward her and might have grabbed her if he hadn't had to shove several men still caught up her genjutsu to the side. But then, all too soon, she ran out of bridge. Throwing herself off was every bit as bad as the first time she'd done it. But she'd judged the arc correctly and her feet came down on the concrete beam with a satisfying and somewhat painful smack. Momentum carried her forward and she had to throw out a hand and use the steel cable, something that tore at her palm again, to keep herself on track, even while the beam itself pivoted on the axis provided by the cable. Their weight was enough to cause the beam to shift, so that she was first running up a hill, then launching herself from the bottom edge of a steep slope. She leapt like she had from the rocks just yesterday, shoving with her chakra at the same time she jumped. And it worked. She still didn't really understand what she was doing, was only operating on the memory of a single accident, but she was suddenly flying. But that was only a split-second's delusion, as it became very clear that she was falling and it was going to hurt, and there were 2 men leaning against the rail at the bow of the yacht and her path was going to take them soaring over their heads and oh god it was going to hurt. She stabbed a kunao into the sail as they swept past it, hoping desperately to shed some momentum, but her kunao was sharp enough and they were heavy enough that it wasn't until the double reinforced edges that it seemed to help at all. They still slammed into the deck with enough force that Chakra, gripping with her feet, only spilled her forward and introduced her knees painfully to the deck, and her nose impacted with only slightly less force, and Tajuna's weight kept going even though she'd stopped. She lost her grip on Tajuna and he spilled forward with a wheezing grunt. Sakura whimpered as she shoved herself up, but there was no time to count her bruises, just enough to blink away the disorientation of being slammed face first against a hard surface. And as she raised her head, knowing that she had to get up, that there were 2 enemies behind her, she saw another man emerge from the pilot house. There was blood from her nose seeping into her mouth, tears spilling from her eyes from more than the pain, and her single, overwhelming thought was, I don't want to die. Kill your heroes. Chapter 6. Thanatophobia, Part 2. Somehow Sakura got herself upright, the first 2 steps in agony in her knees that relaxed just a fraction as she yanked a gasping Tajuna to his feet. She set her weight against his and he stumbled forward and she snapped at him, keep going, setting him in the direction of the pilot house opposite the way the 3rd enemy she'd spotted was coming around. The urgency wasn't lost on him and he lurched forward, smoothing out into a run that still seeming teeth-grindingly slow as he caught his breath. Sakura didn't dare look back, but she didn't need to. She could hear their footsteps, hard and heavy against the deck, far too close for comfort. She'd gotten a glance at them as they'd flown over, one a great, thick-necked bull of a man, more fat than muscle, with heavy mane of hair. His companion had been more wiry, his hair a deep shade of green pulled back into a long ponytail. The latter had worn a sword, but she couldn't remember any visible weaponry on the former. Her shoulders were tense with the anticipation of a kunao, but it never came. Projectile weapons like kunao and shuriken apparently took too much dexterity and practice for the like of this little contingent of Ghetto's thugs, or maybe they just didn't favor them, but there were 3 of them and she'd be just as dead if one of them managed to bash her head hard enough against the windows of the pilot house. It was the footsteps of the fat man that gained on her first, strangely enough, and she felt her heart shudder as something caught at the tips of her hair. Grasping hands. She'd come even with the mast and now she caught it with both hands, using it to shift directions far more quickly than he could. Her momentum swung her out of reach and the way she'd shoved off meant that she could swing her legs up and plant them solidly in his back. She'd meant to do something else then, something that didn't commit her entirely to the strike with another pursuer only feet away, but one hand was slick with blood from where the cable had torn into her hand, the other was slick with nervous sweat, and one wrist was weaker than it should have been. The mast slid from beneath her fingers and she came down on top of her enemy. He went to shove himself up, but she leapt forward, twisting her fingers in his hair and brought his face down against the deck with all the strength of desperation. Once, twice, he went limp, 3 and there was suddenly a cold weight on her shoulder that made her release her victim instantly. Very slowly, carefully, she turned her head until her peripheral vision brought into focus exactly what she'd feared. The blade wasn't well maintained. It was freckled with rust and dull enough it would have earned him a tongue lashing at the academy, but here in the real world, she was learning that it didn't take perfectly maintained weapons to kill someone. I think, he said in a tone heavy with menace, that's enough of that, you little bitch. The sword was resting on her shoulder, angled slightly so that the tip was over the region of her sternum. For now, the edge was straight down, like a dog with its teeth resting lightly against the skin, but it wouldn't take any time at all to twist his and take off her head. Even as she thought that, he put a little more pressure on the blade and it parted the fabric of her dress and bit into her skin. Her eyes flicked reflexively to Tajuna. She'd hoped she didn't even know what she'd hoped, but Tajuna was poised with his back against the rail, almost as if he'd intended to jump and take his chances in the water. But he hadn't made it, and if he'd been any slower at getting his hand up, the wire currently pulled taut around his neck would have killed him. It was being wound up with agonizing slowness by a man whose grin was a clear testament that he wasn't entirely disappointed by these few seconds more of pain and fear. He wasn't watching her at all. And Sakura knew what she had to do. There was an instant where she did not want to, where she absolutely did not want to be the hero, because she was a shinobi and shinobi heroes ended up with their names carved on lonely stone, but training, conscience, something spurred her forward. Her hand dipped toward her kunao pouch and before her captor could do more than snarl a single syllable and press down harder on his sword, 2 kunao were sent on an unerring path straight into the other man's ribs, a third flying wide. Tajuna didn't hesitate, shoving forward with one hand to loosen the wire, the other fist flying forward with work-hardened strength to smash into his attacker's face. The man crumpled. Sakura saw none of this. She didn't even have time to see if her aim was true. Instead, almost as soon as she'd released she wasn't good enough to blind throw, even at that distance she'd let herself fall back, the angle of her collarbone keeping the sword from being easily turned to her throat. If he'd been putting less pressure downward, if he'd turned the sword more initially, or thought to disengage, she'd have been dead. As it was, he tore up a flap of skin and flesh as the sword grated across bone, but as soon as she judged the angle good enough, Sakura launched herself backwards into him. He flung his arms wide as he stumbled back and as soon as Sakura could scramble forward out of reach, she turned on him, kunao in each hand. He snarled and lunged forward and Sakura went to dodge, her feet tangling on the legs of the unconscious man. She fell heavily, one kunao skittering away and only barely shoved herself out of range of a powerful overhead swing that would have split her back open like a rotted log. Her hands smacked against the angled plane of the pilot house windows and she spun herself to the side, eyes barely catching the flash of steel that was the evidence of another thrust. Her breathing was ragged, her knees burned, and she was absolutely certain that she couldn't keep up this pace, but somehow the terrible dance continued as she used the mast to avoid the next stroke, the steel ringing out with an ugly tone that marked it as badly forged. As if that mattered. It grew harder to dodge as she grew more tired, until one thrust almost connected, the blade whistling between her arm and ribs. What came next was instinctive. She clamped her arm down hard, trapping the blade flat and almost harmless in its stillness. It cut, but the blade was dull enough that without real force behind it, it did not cut deeply. She wrenched herself and the sword to one side, tearing it from her enemy's hands. As he lunged forward, she took her one kunao and drove it deep, which left her inside the circle of his arms like some mockery of an embrace. Shifting her weight, setting herself low, ignoring his hands, which tried to pull it back out, and she gave everything she had into driving the kunao up. She trembled as she took on more of his weight, the blade sinking in deeper, ripping as it went. Liquid far more rank and fouler than blood ran down the handle of her kunao, traveled the path of her forearms, dripped off her elbows. Stomach wounds weren't instantly fatal, but they were extremely painful. Which only meant that while his struggles were weak, it seemed to take a very long time for his weight to drape itself limply across her. Some part of her was aware she should have pulled away sooner, dealt with the third man still there, but she was very, very tired. She'd committed almost everything she had to that one strike. So it was that she stumbled ungracefully back, letting him fall to the deck with a dull, meaty thud. Sakura was slow to regain her balance and every breath brought with it a smell that made her want to retch, but she finally turned to see what was next. And she had to blink twice to understand that what was next wasn't going to be a fight, because Tajuna had tied up the third man with his own wire and left him to bleed while he'd sheltered in the pilot house. He waved vigorously at her through the glass, then gestured for her to come inside. Sakura nodded slowly, but before she went, she checked the pulse of the heavier man who'd been the first enemy down. His pulse was very sluggish but present, so she cut up his shirt into makeshift bindings and left him where he lay. About midway to the pilot house, she was suddenly struck with the impression that the deck was vibrating, but as they drew away from the bridge, she understood that it wasn't her imagination. For all that it had sails, this yacht also had a motor. Tajuna grinned at her as she came inside the pilot house. "Trust Gato not to let a little thing like favorable winds get in his way," he crowed. Then he frowned. "Kid, you look like you're either going to fall over or throw up. Sit down." Sakura did so gratefully, but that only gave her the opportunity to see exactly how nasty the sword wound over her collarbone was. There was a ragged flap of skin where it was basically filleted, perhaps 2 inches wide at the collarbone and tapering to a more shallow gash down over the inner side of her right breast. And the whole thing was bleeding freely, which might have explained why she felt so sick. It made her even more sick to look at it, and when she first touched it, to try and stop the bleeding, she spilled the contents off her stomach across the gleaming hardwood. Tajuna didn't even flinch, just glanced worriedly at her while he piloted them away from the bridge, eventually coming to dock at the harbor. "Can you make it?" Tajuna asked her, leaning down with his hands on his thighs. Sakura nodded, not taking her hand from where it was holding a scavenged wad of material in place. The pain was bad, but not impossible. She felt less likely to faint and she'd finished with her dry heaves before Tajuna had left to moor the yacht. So she carefully came to her feet, trying not to jostle anything. Her badly bruised knees had stiffened a little while she sat, so her gait was awkward, but she made it to land and somehow, as slow and hobbling as the journey was, they eventually returned to the bridge to find that the situation had been decidedly resolved in their favor. Sasuke-kun looked battered, but Sakura was deeply relieved to find that everyone had survived. Naruto was looking unusually melancholy, but he brightened when he happened to glance over and notice her approach. "Sakura-chan," he said, galloping toward her, his expression going from pleased to worried to something else entirely as he came closer. His nose wrinkled up. "Ugh, what's that smell?" he complained. "Did you fall into a sewer?" Some part of her knew he didn't mean anything by it. It was just Naruto's way to blurt out almost every thought in his head at the instant it occurred to him, and even she knew what she smelled like. But there was something absolutely filthy crusted up her arms and she was worn raw, and now, finally, it was safe to feel. The flashpoint of her temper exploded, and it was only when Kakashi-sensei's hand settled over her wrist like a shackle and he said sharply, "Sakura," that she realized she had been about to hit Naruto. Not like she usually struck at him, but a real, true blow. Sakura sagged in Kakashi-sensei's grip and the tears began to spill over, turning quickly into gasping sobs because she couldn't breathe through her nose at all. She was dimly aware of Naruto sort of fluttering uselessly, going Sakura-chan? I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that, and rambling on and on until Kakashi-sensei intervened. "Naruto, give us some space," he ordered, and the blonde genin reluctantly complied. Kakashi-sensei stepped in front of her, providing a kind of shield she was grateful for, because though most of the crowd was occupied in dealing with Gato's goons, who had apparently surrendered, Gato himself nowhere in sight, or in a self-congratulatory sort of mood, she felt like people were staring. "How bad is it, Sakura-chan?" Kakashi-sensei asked her gently. "My nose," she said, and here, she brought the hand that wasn't clutching at her makeshift bandage up to cover the other one. Kakashi-sensei reached forward very slowly and pulled down her scarf, necessary because she'd tucked her chin into the hollow of her throat. Sakura still shied away a little at the contact. "You definitely broke it," Kakashi-sensei confirmed. "Luckily, we're somewhere where we can have it set well and you'll be good as new soon. Let's see the other one." Sakura tried to pull the cloth away, but the clotting blood made it pull flesh too, which started the whole thing to bleeding again. Kakashi-sensei frowned, glancing over his shoulder at something. "Sakura, I need to stay here until all of Gato's men are secured. If I send Sasuke and Naruto with you, do you think you can make it to the clinic?" Sakura stared down at her feet, where her toenail polish was so chipped and cracked. Compared to everywhere else, it didn't look too bad, though there was still discomfort from two very hard landings that seemed to increase and reverberate with every step. "Yes. That's a good girl," Kakashi-sensei said, putting one hand very, very gently on her head. "The doctor's here, so I'll send her to meet the three of you. Naruto will be okay, I think, but make sure Sasuke lets himself be examined." Sakura made a vague noise of agreement before turning and sort of shambling in the right direction. Before she'd gone far she paused and turned back. "There's 3 on the yacht. Gato's men," she clarified. 2 were alive. 1 isn't." Kakashi-sensei nodded and, feeling reassured that Tajuna and those men were no longer her responsibility, Sakura began the long, painful second leg of her journey. Coming up from the harbor had been bad. It was worse now that Naruto jogged up alongside her, shooting her looks that mingled worry and curiosity. Out of the corner of her eye, she could make out Sasuke-kun trailing slightly behind, but her world had become an increasingly narrow tunnel that eventually went entirely dark. Her last sensation was pitching forward toward the road in arms that caught her none too gently. Kill your heroes. Chapter 7. Cacophobia. When Sakura woke, a sharp, painful moment where she gained awareness suddenly, heart pounding, but every limb too heavy to move, she found herself in the clinic. Someone had changed her out of her clothes into a loose-fitting shirt and shorts she didn't remember owning, and given how much better she smelled, had probably helped her to clean up as well. She was propped comfortably semi-upright, someone having taken a great deal of care with the arrangement of her pillows. Her fingers tentatively traveled up toward her collarbone, a sense of morbid curiosity driving them, but a noise distracted her. She glanced to the left to find Kakashi-sensei slouching comfortably in a chair, his ever-present novel open. Sakura had a moment's curiosity, likely attributable to the languid and distant feeling that probably indicated strong pain medication, whether it was the same book he was always reading or a series. But the thought drifted away as he spoke. "I wouldn't go prodding that, Sakura-chan. The doctor promised to skin me if you pulled these stitches. We'll have the medicnin look at it when we get back to the village. They'll likely say the wound on your face is cosmetic and the village won't pay for or arrange treatment in that case, but scarring that might compromise your performance is something they take very seriously. So just bear with it for now, Eni." Sakura let her hands fall back into her lap, although the desire to investigate it was still strong. "Although," she thought, "given that the last time I looked at it and touched it, I threw up, it might be for the best to leave it alone." She silently contemplated her hands for a long moment, her sprained wrist freshly rewrapped, the other palm bandaged where she'd torn it on the cable. Sakura had gotten blisters and bruises before, skinned her knuckles during training, but these were her first major injuries. And they were so ugly. That seemed like it shouldn't matter, but it did. All of the teachers in her kunoichi classes, well, they hadn't all been glamorous and sensual, but none of them had scarring. Even though her hair was as long as Ino's, it was so much rougher no matter what sort of products she used. She'd already been at a disadvantage due to her wide forehead and utter lack of specialization. Now she might as well just concede defeat. Sasuke-kun would never. Was Sasuke-kun all right? She asked, suddenly reminded of how battered he'd looked. That was also a first, to have that untouchable image so badly disabused. Kakashi-sensei tilted his head toward the screen to his light. "Sasuke's sleeping off his fight. Nothing nearly as bad as you. Chakra exhaustion, mostly, and some muscle soreness and minor bruising from the senbon, so give him 2 or 3 days and he should be right as rain." Sakura relaxed fractionally at that news, but Kakashi-sensei set her on edge again just as quickly. Without looking over at her, he said, "Eni, Sakura-cha, you know that you're required to speak to someone after making your first kill. Whether it's me or one of the counselors." Sakura's hands clenched over the thin cover, turning it into a mass of wrinkles in her lap. Wrinkles she set out to meticulously smooth as she relaxed her grip. "Yes," she said very softly. "I was going to let you decide," Kakashi-sensei said, "when you were ready. But after the last battle on the bridge, well, with that kind of reckless courage, I couldn't guarantee that given time you wouldn't simply smile your way through your interview. You almost gave Sensei a heart attack for a moment there." Sakura flinched like she'd been slapped, because while she didn't know if she could bear to tell a stranger about those desperate battles, courage really hadn't played any part in it. "I was afraid, Kakashi-sensei. I know. But whatever you might think, that's not something to be ashamed of. It takes a certain amount of wisdom to recognize that there are some fights that you simply can't win. And it's bravery to take action regardless. You didn't freeze or wait for me to save you. And if you a coward, you wouldn't have taken Tajuna with you," he pointed out. "Wouldn't it have been much easier to escape on your own?" Sakura still refused to look at him. "I didn't trust you to save me," she admitted, not without guilt. She was startled when Kakashi-sensei chuckled. "Recognizing that your Jounin-sensei is human too is a normal step in growing up. You just sort of stumbled upon it a little bit earlier than most. And, to be fair, I might have been a little heavy-handed in our last discussion. I all but told you not to depend on me in the same conversation that I said I'd come rushing in to save you. Full marks on your execution of the genjutsu, though." That admission made Sakura glance over at him, but he only flipped a page. That was both irritating and comforting, in the sense that now she knew what a fully intent Kakashi-sensei was like. She wasn't certain she ever wanted to draw his full attention ever again. So she turned her own attention back to her hands, which had worried her covers back into a mess. This time, instead of smoothing them out, she just stared blankly at them. Kakashi-sensei seemed to take that as an invitation. I'm sure you got plenty of lectures in the academy about the difference between personal initiative and acting under orders. One reflects on you, the other on the village. You're accountable for one and the Hokage for the other. Provided that your behavior falls within the guidelines of the Shinobi Code of Conduct and the action you've taken falls under the parameters of your mission, there isn't a law court in Hinokuni that would uphold any charge against you. But, and there was a slight pause and a soft rustle as he finally shut his book, that doesn't change the fact that there's no law powerful enough to let you escape the judgment of your own conscience. Or one that will spare you the judgment of others. There was an old, heavy bitterness there. Some people solve it by marrying their conscience to their orders. Others learn not to care. And others will always care too much. But let me say this, Sakura-chan. On this mission, you have done nothing to be ashamed of. That calm, direct pronouncement seemed to break some sort resolve in her. She was all but shouting as she said, I set a man on fire. Covered him in tar and then set him on fire. And his screams, I can still hear them in my dreams. But even that didn't stop him. He just kept coming. Like he was some sort of monster, his flesh all bubbling and peeling, and he's just coming, and the fire won't go out, and he was going to kill me, and Kami-sama, I can still see his eyes. And I killed him. And his partner. And the man on the yacht. She turned angrily toward Kakashi-sensei, ignoring the way that twisting made the wound across her collarbone ache. Made everything ache and burn. But he was only regarding her thoughtfully. You killed them because they were trying to kill you. And Tajuna, who hadn't done anything worse than stand in the way of one man's greed. And maybe there was some relief when they were dead, but you didn't set out to do it because you found joy or pleasure in it. None of that makes you a bad person, Sakura. But, the fire. Even now she thought she could smell it, tar and grease and cooking meat, and a brief wave of imaginary heat beat against her skin. Even a lot of jounin dislike using fire as anything but a distraction, Kakashi interrupted her. It's not a very clean way to kill, or honestly a very effective one without a very strong jutsu or special preparation, but you worked with what you had. Again, there is no shame in that. I don't think any less of you for having done it. But if you'd let them kill everyone on that bridge, that would have made you trash. Sometimes, we have to make choices we don't like, but I think that you made the right choice. And now, hopefully, we've earned enough of a reprieve for you to make another choice. While a part of me applauds your willingness to fling yourself from high places with a less than optimal understanding of chakra manipulation, I think we can do something about that, he said, eye crinkling up in that familiar, faintly condescending amusement of his. It might help, he offered in a much softer voice, with the dreams. Very, very slowly, Sakura nodded. She hadn't until that moment realized she was crying again, but when she went to wipe her tears away, she flinched. Broken nose, Kakashi-sensei reminded her. Some of the swelling has gone down, but it'll still be very tender. Looks like you're also going to get to sleep in for the next few days. Then he cocked his head, visible pupil sliding toward the screen he'd indicated earlier. It's not very nice to eavesdrop, Sasuke. Especially when you should be sleeping. His voice had undergone a complete tone shift, much harder and sharper than when he'd been addressing Sakura. Sakura froze and an expectant silence filled the room, broken when Sasuke-kun, still looking very battered, but nowhere near as exhausted, shuffled around the screen. His eyes slid accusingly from Kakashi-sensei over to Sakura, who ducked her head and wished for her shimik. Unfortunately, it had probably gone the way of the rest of her clothing, which she suspected meant that it had been trashed. What are you talking about? He demanded roughly. What happened? When both Sakura and Kakashi-sensei were silent, his eyes narrowed. I woke up when I heard Sakura yelling about setting someone on fire, he accused. You can't pretend that that's nothing. Kakashi-sensei eyed him for a long moment, then his gaze slid over to Sakura in an expression she couldn't read, before flipping his book back open in a clear indication that he intended to ignore him. But he didn't leave. Sasuke-kun's stare proved ineffective against the formidable barrier of Kakashi-sensei's ability to overlook things he found irritating, so he was left only with one target. Despite Sasuke-kun's strength and having been matched with him in sparring practice a time or two, Sakura had never felt threatened in his presence. But the world was a different place today, because now she found Sasuke-kun's gaze invasive and unwelcome. "Sakura," he said in a tone that was an unspoken demand. And, for the first time, Sakura considered denying him something he wanted. Somehow, though, what Kakashi-sensei had said came to the forefront of her mind. That if she waited, she'd lie with a smile. She still didn't believe that was true, but she might believe that with every day that passed, it would get harder to talk about. And she knew she didn't want to go through her entire life without ever speaking about it. "The other day, when I was guarding Tajuna," she began awkwardly, finding it strange that so little time had passed, "Gato had 2 of his men try to blow up the bridge and everyone on it." Sasuke-kun's eyes widened, but she was in no mood to enjoy having his attention. I stopped them." Her gaze dropped back to her lap. "The first one, there were barrels of tar waiting to be taken down to the harbor and I was only thinking of running, of keeping him away, until Kakashi-sensei could come, but then he was there and I threw one of them at him. The tar got all over. Little red, shiny specks where she'd been burned littered her arms and had eaten holes in her clothing. And then I used the flare. I didn't think, really, I wanted him to stop and the flare." She swallowed heavily. "The burning magnesium ignited the tar. But he kept coming. So when he tried to stab me, I turned one of his knives against him. I kept the other one. That's what I used to kill his partner. I kept thinking today that I wanted it. That it would have been useful. Slashing edge, instead of stabbing. Today, when I saw the mercenaries, I knew that we couldn't stay on the bridge. So I took Tajuna. I meant to escape to the barge, but the smugglers must have, the only thing there was Gato's yacht. I don't even know why he thought he had to leave men to guard it, except maybe he meant to watch the battle and then leave the rest of his goons behind to do the cleanup while he did something else. I don't know. There were 3 of them. One of them, he had a sword, her hand ghosted up toward her collarbone, but she grasped her upper arm instead, and I stopped them from killing Tajuna. After, Tajuna started the motor and he piloted us over to the harbor. You know the rest after that. It was very rough. If it had been a mock mission report she'd turned in at the academy, she would have been scored down for the lack of clarity and detail. But it was all that she could bear and she was very careful not to look at Sasuke-kun. But after the silence dragged on, something in her managed to pluck up her courage and glance at him from under the cover her eyelashes. She found him glaring at Kakashi-sensei. "You knew," he ground out accusingly, "and you still made her go out on guard duty with you. Without bothering to mention it." Kakashi-sensei's answering look was very cool, bordering on unfriendly. "Yes. And Sakura did just fine. If it had been you, would you have expected me to pull you from duty? Sensei doubts that you would have. Neither you nor Naruto had finished your training, so there wasn't any pressing need to worry either of you. Sakura did better with time to sort things out on her own, without having to worry about her teammates." Sasuke's dark eyes turned to her, something telling her that he expected her to refute Kakashi-sensei. But as bad as going back out to the bridge had been, when she imagined staying behind, it was worse. Because Naruto was incapable of just leaving things be and because it would have been like talking about the battle. Every day she stayed inside the house, sheltered and protected, it would only get harder when she would finally have to step outside again. And though she had a few cherished dreams left, part of her would forever be anchored in the reality that a time would have come when she would have had to leave. There was no part of her that had enjoyed these last few days. None of that rush of victory that had accompanied sparring at the academy, just a profound sense of relief that she had been the one to survive. She did not want to do it again. But she would. The reasons were a tangled morass that even she didn't fully understand. The disappointment of her parents if she quit now. The loss of face she'd suffer when Ino heard. The simple fact that if she wasn't a shinobi, she'd never see Sasuke-kun again. And, most of all, the feeling that it was far too late to escape. The nightmares were already a part of her. Even if she left now, walked away into the fog and never looked back, they would only chase her for the rest of her life. But if she stayed, there would be people who might make it easier, just a little. Civilians like Masa and Tajuna, her teammates. And, just occasionally, Kakashi-sensei. She swallowed again, easing some of the pressure in her throat. Did I do well, Sasuke-kun? Surprise was briefly writ large on his face, before his habitual expression swallowed it. He conceded after a long pause. Her smile was weak, but present. Kakashi-sensei's was more apparent as he stood and stretched. Well, I suppose I'll go check and make certain Naruto hasn't gotten into any trouble. He was throwing a fit when Sasuke caught you and then pretty much collapsed on top of you. The doc had to run off an entire squad of Naruto clones before she could treat either of you. Sakura glanced over at Sasuke-kun to find a blush dusted the high ridge of his cheekbones, the tips of his ears flushed pink. Because of the way things turned out, the doc's doing everything pro bono, so as soon as the two of you can make it back to Tajuna's without collapsing along the way, we'll be waiting. Naruto and I will handle things until then. And then he was gone in a whirl of smoke and leaves, leaving her alone with Sasuke-kun. She was used to a feeling of excitement whenever circumstances conspired to leave them by themselves, but now she almost wished for the familiar sight of his back while he walked away. She felt bad and probably looked much worse. But instead he drew a little closer, fixing her with an unnerving stare. Why didn't you say something at breakfast this morning? Sakura turned her face away, staring at Kakashi-sensei's vacated chair. I didn't want to talk about it, she admitted softly. That drew a noise of frustration, but he thankfully subsided. It must hurt, he offered awkwardly after another long pause. Sakura made a low sound of agreement. I wish he wouldn't have told you about me catching you and then collapsing, he muttered. All that idiot has going for him is stamina. That made her giggle, which she immediately regretted, but she managed to once again control the urge to investigate her stitches. But it drew Sasuke's attention to it. How bad is it? He demanded. She made to shrug with her good shoulder, but had to turn it into a gesture made with her hands. Everything seemed to pull at it. Kakashi-sensei took off before telling me how many stitches it took. But I think the doctor gave me a lot of pain medication, because it doesn't hurt nearly as much as it did. There was another grunt of acknowledgement. If you want to go back to sleep for a while, Sasuke-kun offered, I'll wake you up before it gets so dark that it'll be hard walking back to Tajuna's. Sakura's tremulous smile firmed a little at that. I think, she said after a long pause to consider, that I'd rather go now, while I feel relatively alert but the pain medication hasn't started to wear off. It wouldn't occur to her until much later, but that slow journey back was the first time she'd ever managed to convince Sasuke-kun to walk her home. Kill your heroes. Chapter 8. Catapedophobia. When they returned to Tajuna's home, they found Naruto waiting for them, or rather, for Sakura, like an eager puppy. His eyes were shining and his expression was animated as he danced from foot to foot. Tajuna said that the two of you hijacked Gato's yacht. He exclaimed almost the instant they'd come in the door, Sakura still in the process of very delicately trying to remove her sandals. If she'd been less used to Naruto, she might have lost her balance, but she was both tired and growing accustomed to his antics. So instead she only stared at him for a long moment before she slipped the sandal the rest of the way off, aligning them neatly in the jinkan. I mean, me and Sasuke were busy with Haku, and there was a noticeable dip in his enthusiasm there that she found strange, so I didn't see, but Tajuna said when you saw that crowd of mercenaries you used some sort of awesome jutsu on them that made them freeze up, then, whoosh, you just took off running, threw him over your shoulder and jumped off the bridge. He was bouncing up and down on the balls of his feet by this point, while Sakura was trying hard not to relive those moments when she'd had just enough time while flying to decide how much falling was going to hurt. He swept his hand through the air in sharp diagonal gesture, really into his storytelling by this point. And then you charge down this beam and leap from it onto the deck of the yacht, where you and Tajuna take on 3 goons before sailing off in triumph. It was a lot more heroic sounding when Naruto told it than the actual event. The implicit praise left a bitter taste in her mouth, but she still felt a little residual guilt for trying to hit him earlier in the day. So she only shifted so that one hand clutched at her other arm, which had the advantage of controlling the fine trembling of her hands. It's not you or Sasuke-kun wouldn't have had any trouble. And that, she realized with a strange sense of almost alienation from her body, was very close to the truth. Maybe the leap from the bridge and then from the beam to the yacht wouldn't have gone as well for either of them. That was chakra manipulation and mathematics, but if they'd gotten to the yacht, it would have gone very differently. In her mind, she could still see Sasuke-kun cutting down Zabuza's water clones, quick and breathtaking as a flash of lightning. Naruto, less skilled, but more tenacious, with dozens of shadow clones at his command that could be cut down without ever leaving scars. Just as in that moment when Kakashi-sensei had prompted her into a realization of the team's specialization, she was struck with a feeling that she didn't belong. She'd fought men who were thugs, who might not even have been missing nin, and she was left with flashbacks and nightmares and scars. Sasuke-kun and Naruto had faced down real missing nin without displaying even a fraction of her clumsy desperation. They'd wanted to win a fight. Sakura had just been determined not to die. She had a sudden, unsettling premonition of her future, Kakashi-sensei's words from that night searing across her mind. Surviving brought more battles. More battles and more difficult ones. Because they wouldn't be genin forever. One day, they would be sent on missions like these as a matter of course, not just because of a less-than-truthful commission. Sakura-chan. Naruto asked her with concern, making her realize she'd gone silent and still. Sasuke-kun was looking at her as well. Habit was a powerful thing, even in the face of world-shaking events. An instant, false smile replaced her slack expression. Sorry, I'm a little tired. With a spluttered apology, Naruto scrambled back out of the way and let her come inside the house. But at that moment, not even the prospect of being confined to the house with Sasuke-kun could brighten her spirits. Because she was starting to understand that this wasn't some sort of horrific training exercise where she could close her eyes and wait for it to all be over. It was her life. And like it or not, she had to live it. That was what surviving meant. Kill your heroes. That night, it wasn't only her nightmares that woke her. She'd wondered blearily why she was awake, because there weren't any of those clinging remnants of terror, when the soft noises she heard resolved themselves into something more like speech, though it was too low for her to make out individual words. But from the footfalls, it was Naruto that Kakashi-sensei ushered outside. And when she turned over to make herself more comfortable, she found herself catching Sasuke-kun's gaze before he rolled over and stoically pretended sleep. Kill your heroes. Kakashi-sensei opted to stay in the Land of Waves until construction of the bridge was finished, something that was greatly helped along by the fact that the government of the Land of Waves had seized Gato's assets. Despite all his efforts to assure it was never completed, Gato's ill-gotten gains were going to pay for the construction of the bridge. The only disappointment was that they wouldn't be able to keep all of it. They would eventually have to return at least part of the funds that belonged to his legitimate corporation, but they were spitefully drawing out the bureaucratic process. Though Gato himself had died on the bridge at Zabuza's hand, he'd brought in a lot of mercenaries who had grown used to the easy pickings and who hadn't been at that battle. They were being slowly transferred to the mainland, but Team 7 was still serving guard duty on a rotational basis. Kakashi-sensei took the afternoon shift, which Sakura joined him on when he pronounced her fit enough for light duty after 2 days of miserable fever, which had left her totally unable to enjoy her time with Sasuke-kun, and they generally relieved Sasuke-kun and Naruto at whatever point Kakashi-sensei pronounced was midday. But afternoon was actually the relaxing part of the day, because while he set Sasuke-kun and Naruto on their way with instructions to spar, the results of which he evaluated when they returned Tajuna home at the end of the day, her mornings were graced with Kakashi-sensei's partial attention. Which, for someone who'd never experienced much of it, turned out to be plenty. What Sasuke needs most is practice, and Naruto learns best by repetition, he told her as they faced each other in a grassy meadow not far from Tajuna's house. It was not long before dawn and the world was cast in grey light that was less ominous than the last time they'd had a talk like this, though it helped that Kakashi-sensei was far less intense this time as well. Pairing them makes good sense for both their learning styles. You, on the other hand, are a genjutsu type, which comes hand in hand with a high intelligence. And you can't come within 20 feet of the academy as a potential Jounin sensei without hearing the instructors complain about how hard it is to get genjutsu types engaged in class exercises. Your learning style is just different. Ninjutsu and taijutsu types learn best with their bodies, but that busy little brain of yours makes your attention wander if it isn't suitably occupied. give you a diagram and a demonstration and you learn things easily, so during basic drills you tend to pay more attention to that cute shinobi in the second row than your forms. And, worst of all, you're smart enough to figure out the least amount of effort you can put into anything and still be praised for it. Sakura blushed at the accuracy of that assessment. Drill, when they weren't doing new maneuvers or anything particularly difficult, had been something she'd done with minimal effort and concentration. And she had spent a lot of time eyeing Sasuke-kun during it. But then Kakashi-sensei was speaking again, and unlike her exercises in the academy, she gave him her full attention. I don't want you to take away from this that drill is unimportant. Because it is. Building muscle memory can save your life in combat situations. But it's a poor fit for you, so we're going to try things a little differently in your training. And now that we have some Sensei and Sakura time, we can continue where we left off. Movement. Just movement? Sakura asked hesitantly. Your Taijutsu style is textbook academy standard, Kakashi-sensei replied flatly. Frankly speaking, it's like off-the-rack clothing. Because it's been designed to fit everyone, it doesn't fit anyone well, though it'd be just fine if you weren't in a combat squad. And if you were male, it might work regardless if we put enough effort into it. But your strength isn't ever going to be in height, reach, or weight. Your advantage is going to be in chakra manipulation, so it's a little bit pointless to teach you anything new until we find your limits there. Then he smiled, glancing over at her. Also, I think it's a little bit early in the healing process to think about any intense taijutsu training. Sakura allowed herself a cautious sigh of relief at that, but then another thought occurred to her. And genjutsu? She prodded. Kakashi-sensei made a thoughtful-sounding hum. I'll make you a deal, Sakura-chan. If you have enough energy left to have trouble sleeping at night, I'll teach you a genjutsu. But, he said, holding up a finger, only one per week. The rest of the time, you can distract yourself by considering how they might be applied in the field. Knowing one jutsu and knowing how and when to use it is more valuable than 10 you don't. She nodded and her eyes fell to the large sack at Kakashi-sensei's side. What's that, sensei? Training tools. But before we get to them, let's see if we can't teach you how to jump from high places without doing any permanent damage to your joints, any? It's sort of a pity that we're out of the village. I think you're one of the few who'd actually benefit from some of the reference texts. But no help for that. I'll just explain as we go along. Unlike her teachers at the academy, Kakashi-sensei wasn't quick to praise her. Though it wasn't that he was quick to scold or correct, either. It was mostly that he would explain briefly what he wanted her to do, demonstrate it once, and then leave her to untangle the particulars on her own while he napped nearby. It was the least guided set of guided exercises she'd ever participated in. At first she was resentful of this approach, until success taught her that the overly detailed lectures of her former teachers were a crutch she didn't need. And, some part of her acknowledged, given how he'd collapsed before and how often he was awake in the night with his students, maybe the extra sleep was a good idea if things went sour. She found quickly that working through each chakra manipulation on her own was far more rewarding than being hand-fed every single thing, which had been an enormous source of her frustration with Naruto in the academy. She'd always mastered things like this quickly, which made it irritating to have to wait for the teachers to coach the slowest students through the exercises over and over. Her patience would quickly be spent and her mind would wander to other, more appealing things, like how perfect Sasuke-kun's profile was. Not here. As soon as she'd suitably mastered one thing, Kakashi-sensei foisted another on her. Having mastered leaping from limb to limb very quickly, she moved on to leaping from heights with more caution. Her recent experience was riding her heavily, and her slightly cautious approach to learning physical things made her work her way up to more extreme heights gradually. But as the heights increased, she grew more uneasy, making simple mistakes that made her land harder or more awkwardly than she should have. She lost confidence with each of them and a sick feeling grew in her stomach. After one particularly bad landing, she crouched down and wrapped her arms around her legs, cradling her chin on her knees. This isn't working, she thought to herself. Soon she'd really screw it up, get herself hurt again, and then where would she be? But she was already taking all the precautions she could think of and working under the most controlled conditions she could manage. And still she was afraid in a part of her mind, a very small part, separate from that fear, knew it was the reason she kept faltering. Closing her eyes, she tried to imagine what Kakashi-sensei might do to help her. And then sighed, because help and Kakashi-sensei still sounded a lot like antonyms, especially when it came to coaxing her through her personal fears. So she turned her imagination on her teammates, being stonewalled again when it came to Sasuke-kun. If Sasuke-kun was afraid, she doubted he would ever admit it. And he'd probably find some way to push it to the side and perform perfectly regardless. That left only Naruto. But while she had a good idea what Naruto might do, she didn't know if she could scrape together enough courage to do it. Or if it was even a good idea. Because Naruto would find the tallest tree around and pitch himself from the top, consequences and fears be damned. But if she could make it and do it without getting hurt, anything else on this island would be a shorter jump. And, compared to the trees at home, there was nothing that grew here that was overwhelmingly tall. Somewhere deep in the recesses of her memory, she could vaguely remember lectures about overcoming fear by confronting it directly, even though she didn't know if it should be applied to flinging herself from high places. Even though a part of her knew it was stupid, she dragged herself to her feet and forced herself forward, trepidation growing with each step. But pride pushed against a desire for the fear to just be over, and almost before she knew what she was doing, she scaled a likely-looking tree and balanced herself on the very tip, having learned during their branch leaping session how to infuse chakra into surfaces that wouldn't normally support her weight. And before sense could catch up, she jumped. Sakura choked on her scream on the way down, branches rushing by slapping at her exposed arms, but she was too concerned with the ground rushing up to meet her feet. Bad idea was the loudest fragment of thought rushing through her mind, but it was whipped away quicker than the limbs. Instead, everything became about chakra. In those long, painful seconds, she'd never been so sharply aware of it. Not the ease with which it could flow and ebb, shift and change, nor the sheer possibility inherent in it. It should seem impossible that this thing inside her could break mountains, conjure fire, shape the very air, but if it couldn't, she was about to get a very visceral definition of the term comminuted fracture, which was another broken fragment of thought that rocketed around in her head. Her heart seemed to be falling at a different rate than the rest of her, as it seemed lodged in her throat, and her breakfast was struggling to shove its way past it. But as long as the fall felt, it was over quickly, her trembling fingers touching softly against the prickly blanket of pine needles that blanketed the forest floor. She'd been crouching lightly, dispersing the force of impact through her body just as Kakashi-sensei had shown her, but she toppled forward onto her knees and breathed in great, gasping breaths. Kakashi-sensei landed next to her without even disturbing the pine needles at his feet. Sakura-chan. She managed to out a somewhat strangled noise of acknowledgement. There was a long pause, as if Kakashi-sensei couldn't decide quite what to say to her. Did you have a nice fall? That was terrible, Kakashi-sensei. She gasped. Ma, he said. You landed safely. But what were you trying to do? She made a stumbling explanation, which had Kakashi-sensei staring skeptically down at her. And did it work? No, she said very firmly. Then, maybe. That earned her a head pat, which was beginning to make her feel like a favorite pet rather than a favored student. It hadn't escaped her that Kakashi-sensei only did it to her habitually. Want to try it again? He asked. Kill your heroes. When she'd gotten falling down to an art that no longer fazed her, which took her the better part of a week and left her with just enough restlessness near the end to earn her the Magen, Kokanai Reizu no Jutsu, which Kakashi-sensei had introduced rather unimpressively as the weakest of the environment genjutsu, they moved on to something else. Running. But nothing so passé as assigning her laps. This morning found them on the veranda, the faint light of morning just enough for her to read the topographical map he'd weighted with stones, that curious bag back at his side again. So, Kakashi-sensei said, tapping one of the smooth stones idly against the map, rules. No climbing trees, no weapons, you'll need water walking, so that's allowed. No forfeit accepted. Your task is to get from here, he said, pointing to where Tajuna's house was, to another point not quite all the way across the cluster of islets, but close, to here. That's it. Sakura asked quizzically as she tried to memorize the map. Do I have a time limit? Not a time limit as such, but... Kakashi-sensei's voice trailed off. Well, I guess you might call it incentive to give it your best, Eni. He wasn't looking at her, but his tone of voice had shifted dangerously and Sakura had to fight off a shiver. Here, go stand across the yard. Wait until I give you the signal. Now wary, her heart thumping just that little bit quicker in her chest, Sakura did as she was told. The peaceful atmosphere had vanished, replaced instead by that kind of ominous stillness right before a storm breaks. There was no particular reason why she should feel like something terrible was about to happen, but already her palms felt sweaty and her breathing was uneven. Kakashi-sensei bit his thumb, hands shifting through hand signs so quickly none of them registered, but when he slapped his hand down against the wood, she couldn't fail to miss the 3 dogs that remained when the smoke cleared. After 5 minutes, he said calmly, as if there wasn't an enormous bulldog glowering at her from just behind his shoulder, I'll send Shiba, Uroshi, and Bull after you. And Sakura? They do bite. Now, go. She bolted. Kill your heroes. Chapter 9. Cynophobia. For all that farm crops wouldn't grow, there was enough undergrowth along the edge of Tajana's yard to set her shins to stinging as she bolted into the trees. Sakura had no particular fear of dogs, nor did she think that Kakashi-sensei would intentionally hurt her outside of training. But none of that seemed relevant beneath the sudden, crushing tide of fear. It left no room for thoughts like why, and barely enough space for her to remember she had somewhere she was running to, her mind dominated by what she was running from. Every tall weed lashing at her leg became the first press of teeth, every breeze that rustled branches the noise of pursuit. She'd gone a half-dozen yards before she even gathered herself enough to correct her heading. She ran like she'd run on the bridge, like she'd run on the deck, without regard to how mottled her skin might get or how much she might sweat or how she looked. She just ran. While that might have been for the better, some of the things that her instructors at the academy had tried fruitlessly to drill into them until they were automatic were lost as well. Her posture was loose and sloppy, her pace without concern for stamina, and because of the discomfort caused by breathing through her still tender nose, she was soon gasping air desperately through her mouth. When they'd done sprints in the academy, she'd had a pretty good sense of timing, of knowing within a fairly close margin how fast she'd gone before the instructor called it. But her sense of time faded, reduced to the heavy thunder of her heartbeat. She couldn't measure how far she'd gone when he loosed the dogs. There was no barking in the distance to warn her. And because they'd reached heavier pine stands, where the underbrush thinned out, there wasn't even the noise of that bulldog's massive body coming through the undergrowth. What she got instead was a hair-raising chorus of snarls that didn't sound nearly far enough away for comfort. She thought she'd already reached the limits of adrenaline-induced speed, but somehow she spurred herself faster, stumbling and half-sliding down a muddy bank as she finally reached the edge of the large main aisle. Her foot caught on one of the exposed mangrove roots in her hurry and she lurched forward, managing to catch herself before she fell, but the movement pulled at her healing chest wound. It burned, as did her still bruised knees, which she'd had less trouble with when she was strengthening them with chakra during her tree climbing and leaping exercises. That thought somehow penetrated the haze of panic that was clouding her mind and she sprinted forward with fresh, chakra-enhanced speed. It let her draw further from the dogs, their snarling turning now to open barking. It was not the full-throat baying of hounds, but it was close enough to keep sprinting forward with all her might despite the growing stitch in her side. She was running faster than she ever had before, and even if the terrain had been familiar, the speed at which she was moving would have made some things harder to track regardless. Leafy branches seemed to whip out of nowhere and she caught a face full of spiderweb, resident intact. It seemed to burn and she clawed at it, trying to get it off, and her shoulder caught the trunk of a tree. The force of it whirled her around, her shoulder aching, but she managed to both crush her passenger and get herself turned back around without falling. It cost her. Sakura lost all the space she'd gained between herself and the dogs, one of the smaller ones darting forward, teeth just missing the hem of her dress, her heel nearly clocking him in the jaw as she pushed her body back into motion. She used chakra and she was slowly getting better at it, only almost pitching herself into another tree before she was running again. Her perception of the world had tightened until it contained only trees and land and dogs and a destination that always seemed so far away. But some part of her recognized if she kept going, kept running, she would reach it. That spurred her across several more uninhabited islets even though her throat was beginning to really hurt and her side was cramping up, but as they grew smaller and some part of her began to think, I can do this, a line of kunao rocketed into the dirt near her feet. They were so close that they kicked debris into her open-toed sandals. Sakura was run almost ragged by this point. She hadn't thought she'd have the energy to be frightened any further, but she was proven wrong as she stumbled backward, landing hard on her butt. Her eyes automatically darted up along the path of their flight, where she caught the briefest flash of movement. Before she could decide whether it was Kakashi-sensei or not, she caught sight of another kunao. She barely managed to jerk her arm out of the way before it could be pinned to the ground. Somehow she got herself up and moving again, but now, rather than carving as straight a line as the growth would allow her, she found herself playing a treacherous kind of game that had her ducking around trees and dodging awkwardly. She couldn't just run anymore, the kunao and the fear of being struck by them forcing her to keep a wary eye above, where she could just catch flashes of movement before more kunao were sent flying her way. Her stamina was flagging badly and she was almost stumbling forward rather than running by the time she reached her target point. As she came to a stop at the crest of the tiny islet, the first thing she did was double over and empty her stomach of everything she'd eaten for breakfast and most of what she'd had for dinner. She had somehow gotten filthy, she hurt everywhere, and there was sweat dripping into her eyes and off the tip of her nose. She didn't even have enough energy to glare at Kakashi-sensei when he arrived looking distinctly unruffled, just enough to shamble away from the mess she'd made and then sort of collapse to the ground. Ah, Sakura, you'll cramp up like that. You might want to walk around a little to cool down. As it turned out, she did have the energy to glare, even as she struggled back to her feet, but she wasn't alone in her discontent. His ninkin were regarding him grumpily as well. This was just mean, Kakashi, the tan one said from where he sat. The gray-furred one with the mohawk agreed. Chasing genin is not cool at all, bossman. The giant bulldog made a wuffling sound that Sakura interpreted as agreement. Now, everyone, Kakashi-sensei scolded them, eye crinkling smile in place, you make it sound like there wasn't a point to this exercise. Sakura was still wheezing, so she demanded, and? By the weight of her stare. Kakashi-sensei fished a stopwatch from his pocket. You beat your best run time in the academy quite handily. I needed a baseline with you giving it your all, so. Couldn't you have just told me? I could have, he acknowledged, but I wanted you to show me something not even you thought you could do. We're going to work until you can do at least this much without ever breaking a sweat. Sakura's stare was incredulous now. She broke off and shook her head. You threw kunao at me? She accused. Not kunao. Just pine cones, Kakashi-sensei said, smile deepening. That's what was in that bag. A practical application of the genjutsu you learned this week. It can make something harmless look like something dangerous. And it can make something dangerous look harmless. But, and his tone shifted more toward lecture mode, it's very weak. If you weren't already panicking, you might have noticed. You have to scene set for that particular genjutsu if you don't want your opponent to realize at an awkward moment what's really happening. If you'd managed to think through your fear and tried a simple kai, you might have managed to break the first genjutsu I used. Very simple emotional manipulation. Also very common. But you'll have plenty of time to think about that. You and my ninkin will be working together in the mornings, though I promise it won't be a hair-raising a chase as this morning. Let's see, as incentive I'll repeal the no muddy paws and no kisses rule for you, Sakura. That earned the attention of his ninkin, whose ears perked, tails giving a cautious wag. So you're gonna let us run loose? The gray-furred one demanded. You got it, Kakashi-sensei agreed. Sakura frowned, not at all certain she liked this arrangement, but the fear of the chase was something that ran deep in her now. She'd suffer it if it meant being able to outrun the things that pursued her. Her breathing was easing somewhat, which gave her space to ask, won't summoning your ninkin use up a lot of chakra? Because, they're summons, right? Ah, Kakashi-sensei said as he exchanged the stopwatch for his book, not really, no. At least not in the way you're probably thinking. Most people use summons as the catch-all term. You covered summons contracts in the academy, right? So you know the scrolls are rare and the vast majority are in the possession of major clans. They represent ancient pacts with groups of very powerful creatures that can live dozens of human lifetimes and attain massive size. And their chakra stores aren't anything to scoff at, either. The contract isn't necessarily exclusive, just limited by the generosity of the scroll's owner, basically. My Ninken are personal summons or contracted animals. I raised them all. The only difference between them and the Inuyasha Ninken is that I don't typically bring them out in the field with me. They spend a lot of time lounging in my apartment or playing around in the village, not some other world. They'll live about as long as I will, and while they have plenty of chakra to be good ninja companions, they aren't, say, in the league of any of the summons of the legendary three. Our contract is exclusive and non-transferable. The only chakra I spend is what it takes to get them here. With the right preparation and some cooperation, you could do the same thing to a human. Sakura made a thoughtful noise, risking a closer look at his dogs now that she didn't feel like she was in danger of being torn to shreds by them. But Kakashi-sensei wasn't finished speaking. Your dodging is sloppy, he reported conversationally. You basically throw yourself out of the way, which takes you a lot of energy to recover from. You don't have the stamina for that. And even if you did, there's no point in not correcting bad habits since we're basically starting from scratch regardless. And your form, well, not something I would have given you good marks for in the academy. Even if you're scared to death, you should have done it so often it's automatic. The pack knows what a proper form should look like, so I'm sure they'll give plenty of pointers. Kill your heroes. The addition of cute, furry animals to her new running regime did not make it particularly more pleasant. Considering that it was conducted just after dawn and she wasn't allowed breakfast until afterwards, she didn't know what would. None of them were afraid to offer criticism, which was almost harder to take coming from a dog, and they all seemed to think it was particularly fun to tackle her into puddles, rivers, and occasionally trees. Their muddy paw prints stained, their nails scratched, and she found herself the target of wet, sloppy kisses that were gross. It did not make her run as fast as thinking they'd pull her down and eat her, but it pushed her much harder than any of her academy practices ever had. After all, she suddenly had 8 sharp-eyed dogs focused on her training, which made shirking a practical impossibility. Pakun, for all that he was the smallest of the 8, turned out to be the de facto leader in Kakashi-sensei's absence. He was patient, knowledgeable, and not above setting up punishment games that usually turned out in his favor. Tsunami had willingly loaned her the basin that she used to hand-wash clothes in, but Sakura had avoided explaining that she'd underperformed on one of Pakun's training goals and was about to sacrifice her own shampoo and conditioner to give a dog a bath. I hope human shampoo damages your fur, she'd thought spitefully as she lathered him up. It hadn't. Pakun had told her sagely that her rough hair was evidence of a bad diet and lack of vital nutrients and that she should eat more balanced and plentiful meals. When he'd recommended his own supplement plan to her, she'd considered drowning him. Her rewards, such as they were usually in his favor too. Being offered the chance to touch the pad of his paw, which turned out, unfairly enough, to be softer and smoother than her own feet, didn't seem like something the Sakura who'd never seen Wave Country would have felt was at all equal to the misery of several hours of intensive training. The current Sakura who had just had a vague hope that one day it would be easier. Though she was hardly ever alone, she felt more isolated from her team than ever. Her training started before the others woke, she breakfasted after they left, she barely saw them at shift change, and even in the evenings, when she would have been content to watch Kakashi-sensei coach her teammates after she'd helped Tsunami with the dishes, Kakashi-sensei left her with chakra control exercises that she usually fell asleep in the middle of. But bridge construction continued regardless of her feelings or nagging sense of exhaustion. And one day, when construction was almost finished, Kakashi-sensei dropped in about midway through her morning training session. The Ninken greeted him eagerly and Sakura took the reprieve as a chance to lace her hands behind her head so she could breathe more freely. When Kakashi-sensei had pacified everyone with a perfunctory head pat, he turned to her. His expression was sober and Sakura felt a jolt of alarm, hands falling to her side. He sighed and scratched at the back of his neck. Your second enemy from the barge. The heavy-set one. He died this morning. What do you mean? Sakura asked, instinctively taking a step back, as if his words were something that she could and should escape. Head wounds can be tricky. He just never woke up, that's all. He went into cardiac arrest this morning and couldn't be revived. I wanted to tell you now, because it'll be in the report when we return to the village. Sakura stared at him, then her gaze dropped to her feet. Her muddy, aching feet, her toes a tracework of scratches. She tried to focus on that, but tears came regardless. She swiped at them with the back of her hand and told herself that she needed to stop this. It could have as easily been her, lying on that deck. Both of them had made a choice and he'd paid for his and she for hers. That was all. It didn't stop her from crying, but it kept her from sobbing, which was better than she'd managed before. And unlike Kakashi-sensei, who just stood to one side, the Ninken crowded around her, pressing warm heads against the palms of her hands and generally made a nuisance of themselves as several of them competed to comfort her. Finally, after long minutes, the tears dried up and she could face Kakashi-sensei again. All right, she managed thickly. And the other? Something in her couldn't help but ask. He'll live. Blood loss and a collapsed lung. He's already been transferred to the mainland. Sakura made a noise of acknowledgement. When Kakashi-sensei didn't make any move to leave, she just regarded him quietly, one hand drifting up to clutch at her upper arm. He was scrutinizing her very carefully, which made her uncomfortable. She twisted one sandaled foot against the ground. The Pax told me you've gotten better at augmenting your movements with chakra. Of course, that doesn't excuse you from the regular kind of training either, because just how much you can augment depends upon what's there to being with, but you already know that you're much more advanced with your chakra control than most ninja your age. It should be just enough to show you this. Unlike the other two, when I tell you you're not ready to use it in combat, I expect you to respect my judgment. Is that understood? He asked her gravely. Yes, Kakashi-sensei, she replied. He nodded, then abruptly, in a movement so fast she didn't even see him move, he was behind her and all that was left in his place was a cloud of smoke and whirling leaves. So far as chakra augmented speed goes, he said as she whirled around, the Shunsen no Jutsu is the apex of it. Movement so fast that it appears to the normal human eye to be teleportation. Sakura's hands twitched, then clenched as he explained the theory behind it and the string of hand signs she'd need to use to help her focus her chakra. She wasn't strengthening any single muscle group, but rather her entire muscular and circulatory system, and not just in the tempered way she'd practiced. Now, just a step or two, Kakashi-sensei cautioned her. To get the feel of it. You won't be able to actually use the Shunshin without practice, but this will be movement much faster than you're used to. It took her several attempts for her speed of movement to satisfy Kakashi-sensei, but when it worked, she had a feeling more like displacement than movement, as if she'd left her heart behind when she'd stepped forward. Her hands shook a little as she unlaced her fingers from the hand sign. Part of it was a sudden feeling of increased exhaustion. She'd failed her first attempts simply because she hadn't invested enough chakra in it. Good, good, Kakashi-sensei praised her. Now, he said, try to use it to follow me. He led her in an incredibly quick start-stop pattern that drained her more with every shift, until she was blindly following him. He'd increased the distance of each flicker until they stood perhaps 10 feet apart. 10 feet didn't seem like such a great distance. Until she was moving far faster than she could see. Kakashi-sensei stepped back and she stepped forward and suddenly it was only the iron bar of his arm keeping her from a tree. His other hand, index, and middle finger held stiffly extended, came to rest at her throat. Now, here's the disclaimer. Your chakra control is very good. But you're not good enough yet to learn to channel chakra to your eyes. They're much more sensitive to chakra disturbance than anything else, so if you're not careful, you'll blind yourself. And if you're moving faster than you can see and understand, an enemy is just going to stand still and let you impale yourself on a kunai. I wanted you to know what you're walking towards, Sakura-chan, but you're not there yet. Kill your heroes. The bridge was at last complete, their time in wave over. And it would bear Naruto's name. But that was alright. While Tajuna spoke to Naruto and Kakashi-sensei, she was waved over by Masa and a milling knot of other workers. Here, he said, pressing something into her hand, which turned out to be a neatly wrapped package. As she unwrapped it, a new shimok spilled into her hands, this one not nearly as plain as the first, the pattern in a red that was vivid against white. It won't last as long as a bridge, he said with a wry smile, but it'll serve as a reminder that we remember who was there when there wasn't anybody around to hear any speeches. Who kept us alive so that we could build the bridge at all. Sakura's hands tightened on the fabric. Thank you, she managed, more earnest in those 2 words in this moment than she'd ever been before. Masa grinned more widely and another of the workers, Jiro, she remembered, clapped her on the shoulder. Don't be a stranger, he said, come back when you're old enough and we'll buy you a drink to celebrate properly. Sakura could only nod. And feel that, somehow, all her pain hadn't been for nothing. Kill your heroes. Chapter 10. Scopophobia, Part I. She'd left with the ambition of spending time with Sasuke-kun. She was returning with scars and the knives of a dead man and memories of combat, which made her feel like a stranger in her own home. So it was that Sakura was very subdued as they headed to the mission office to be debriefed, even though Naruto was so excited that only Kakashi-sensei's none-too-discreet grip on his collar kept him from rushing ahead and announcing to all and sundry that he was Uzumaki Naruto, future Hokage, and they'd already started naming bridges after him, believe it. Sasuke-kun was just characteristically aloof, but judging by the force he'd put into thrusting his hands in his pockets, it was taking most of his self-control not to smack Naruto. Naruto hadn't really made an effort to rub it in specifically, that he'd come out far the better of his 2 teammates, but he'd done so much gloating in general and expounded at length about his grand plans for fame and Hokage-dom that he'd even earned a rebuke from Kakashi-sensei to tone it down. Sakura's stitches had been removed back in wave, so the scar at the edge of her mouth was plainly visible. It had healed well, considering, and if it hadn't been on her face, she wouldn't have made much of a fuss about the thin pink line. But it felt like a brand, something that everyone could look at, read, and know things about her that she didn't want to share. And, well, she was also a preteen girl who'd invested a lot of time and effort into her looks. Even if it didn't have such damaging memories associated with it, she wouldn't have liked to have people staring. So Sakura was overly conscious of the scar, careful to keep her head down, hiding beneath the barrier of her shimmick. It, at least, was something she didn't regret, and she ran her fingers over the edge of it for comfort as they came inside the mission office. The Hokage himself was present again in the general missions room, just as he'd been the day they'd been issued the mission, though that was far from being always the case. Sakura couldn't have said if it bad luck or by design, but she shifted uneasily under the knowing, weighted gaze that swept over them, to land with fond indulgence on Naruto, who hadn't even waited for an acknowledgement to begin regaling everyone present with his version of the story. Her eyes traveled to the right of the Hokage, to find Iruka-sensei on duty as well, while the other Chunin sitting to the left was a stranger to her. Her hand came up to clutch at her arm even as Naruto began to embellish his tale with broad gestures and sound effects. Her grip grew tighter as he came to her part, or at least the one that he knew, which made the attention of the Chunin and the Hokage focus on her briefly. She tucked her chin in tighter and glanced away, turned her unmarked cheek toward them. The Hokage must have found his retelling of events amusing, because he let him continue without interruption until it came to the point where he was just re-emphasizing that he was destined for greatness because there was already a bridge bearing his name. "Well, it sounds like you had a very interesting time," the Sandaime said. "I expect that there's a much less exciting version of things in your report, Kakashi." Kakashi-sensei agreed, unearthing a scroll and a packet from his pouch and handing it over to the Sandaime, who unrolled it in a practiced motion. They stood in relative patience and with varying levels of silence as he read through it, his expression inscrutable. "I see," he said at last. "Well, it was unfortunate that things turned out as they did. And, Kakashi, you were perhaps a little remiss in failing to update the village on the mission requiring reclassification. No one worried because you said you might keep your genin out for training, but I think this might have been a little excessive. Even if they sent along enough funds to pay the difference, you might have assumed that I would be a little hesitant in allowing genin to participate in an A-class mission." "Hey, that's not fair, Gramps," Naruto protested. "Weren't you listening? We did just fine." Sarutobi-sama sighed. "Regardless, this village has standards that will be adhered to. All of you will be paid as if this were an A-ranked mission, and that's how it will go on your records, but don't expect that you'll be intentionally assigned any more missions like this until you're a proper rank. Now, and he clasped his hands over Kakashi-sensei's report. "I expect your own reports to be handed in no later than 2 days from now. I imagine you are all looking forward to seeing your beds again, so I won't keep you from it. Though I'm going to borrow a minute of your sensei's time. And Sakura-chan, if you could stay behind as well." Sakura stared at the floor as Naruto glanced over at her curiously. "Why's Sakura-chan gotta stay behind?" he demanded. He was rewarded by Kakashi-sensei's fist coming down on his head somewhat less than gently. "I think that's enough blatant disrespect for today," he said wryly. "Shoo." Naruto scowled up at Kakashi-sensei but did as he was told, while Sasuke-kun had walked away without a second glance when the Hokage had dismissed them. Both the Chunin were casting sideways glances at the Hokage, obviously wondering the same thing as Naruto but too respectful to outright demand answers. "Sakura-chan, your sensei reports that even though this was your first mission outside the village, during the course of the mission you killed 4 men while defending the bridge builder." Sakura wished that Iruka-sensei's surprise wasn't so obvious, the way he jerked his head around to stare at the Hokage before turning back to her, eyes still wide. Even the other Chunin looked a little unnerved. "Yes, sir," she answered quietly. "He also reports that he has already spoken to you about the experience, but I have some knowledge of what Kakashi considers adequately dealing with bothersome things like emotions. We do have counselors available for you, if you need them." Sakura drew in a deep, unsteady breath, but she met the Hokage's gaze squarely. "I understand, sir." She had no intention of seeking them out. Perhaps if they'd returned immediately to the village, back when the nightmares were at their worst and she was newer to them, she might have. But she could sleep more or less through the night now, even if it worked best when she was weighted down by exhaustion, and she couldn't imagine letting a stranger prod at her personal fears. She was a little surprised when the Hokage rose, the 2 Chunin rising with him. Tucking his hands inside his sleeves, Sarutobi inclined his head, the 2 Chunin bowing more deeply from the waist. "The village thanks you for your service, Harano Sakura," the Hokage told her gravely, the Chunin rising only when he'd finished speaking. "Though I am sorry that it had to come so early in your career." Sakura could only nod around a knot of complicated emotions, bowing to the Hokage before leaving Kakashi-sensei to face an actual debriefing. She didn't know whether or not he'd be reprimanded for his actions, but for the moment she was only glad she'd only had to revisit Wave in a written report. And that report was already finished, though she'd been too eager in her escape to hand it in. She made her way home instead, using the rooftop paths for the very first time. Once, she'd thought it would make her feel like a real ninja, but after Wave, it seemed like less of a milestone than it once had. Though it was a strange sort of feeling, to soar above the crowded streets and see her home from a different point of view. Sakura stopped at her neighbor's home before actually returning to her own. Miwa-san, who'd been her mother's close friend in the academy and remained so once they graduated, had promised to house-sit and collect the mail while Sakura was away. Sakura had long since learned to view her as a kind of aunt, given that she'd looked after her while her parents were away after her baba had passed. She allowed herself to be briefly enveloped in a hug before pulling away and offering an excuse to avoid being invited to dinner. Miwa-san's 2 young sons, when combined, had about the same amount of tact as Naruto, and Sakura had no desire to answer a lot of questions, not even for a home-cooked meal. She let herself into the empty house with a sigh of relief, shuffling curiously through the mail. When she found a letter from her mother, she ripped it open eagerly, photos spilling out. Sakura laughed at the pictures of her mother posing with hawk chicks small enough to fit in her cupped hands, her habitual serious expression nowhere to be seen. She was grinning widely at the camera, the lines bracketing her mouth less noticeable, making her look years younger. Sakura suddenly missed her mother fiercely, as she hadn't for a long time. Her mother was a career Chunin who handled the messenger birds that formed one of the major communication networks both in the village and outside it, so it wasn't as if she lived in fear of a message announcing that her mother had died in combat. But her specialty was breeding and training the fierce, powerful hawks that saw the most use in inter-village and border communications, which meant that most of her time was spent at one of the border stations. It wasn't as if it was a particularly unusual story. Being a shinobi meant being willing to accommodate the needs of the village, and while Harano Mabuki was occasionally transferred back to the central aviary in the village proper, she shared that rotation with several other ninja just as eager to see their families again. When Sakura had been very young, she'd taken a position that she hadn't enjoyed nearly as much in order to be with her daughter, but once Sakura had been old enough to enroll in the academy, she'd returned to her former position. Sakura had been left primarily in the care of her father's mother, who'd lived with them for as long as she could remember, and after she'd died there'd been Miwa-san. So it wasn't as if this was something new or unexpected, but there was a strange sense of betrayal lurking in the corners of her mind. Her parents had always carefully made time for the major events in her life, and she was filled with a sense that this shouldn't have been any different. As if, somehow, her mother should have sensed that something was amiss and been waiting for her, ready to. Even Sakura didn't know how to finish that sentence. Make everything all right again, maybe. Not to ask questions, but not to not ask questions. Some impossible thing was what she wanted of her mother. But her mother wasn't here and, judging by the content of her letter, might not be home again until the new year. And even if she didn't have some vague recollection of the details of A-class missions having to be sent using some method other than regular post, and requiring some sort of permission besides, it wasn't something she wanted to say in writing. I killed a man today, mother. Not when she finally understood why her parents had been both proud and worried when Kakashi-sensei had been introduced to them as her teacher. She would have settled for her father's reassuring presence, but Harano Kaizushi's jovial, charismatic nature and ability to project an air of harmless civilian served him well in his career in intelligence gathering, which meant that while he didn't have a permanent posting like her mother, he came and went with little notice. He might be home tomorrow or he might reappear with gifts and a profuse apology months later. Like her mother, he was also a career chunin, his missions running less in the vein of plots to overthrow the daimyo and more in the way of confirming or denying the extramarital habits of wealthy people, which to hear him tell it, could be more dangerous than you'd expect. But, so far at least, he'd always come home safe and sound. But he wasn't here now. So, without parents' arms to throw herself into, Sakura spent the rest of the day catching up on the domestic tasks she usually resented. But somehow, something so utterly everyday as vacuuming seemed to ground her a little. She was in the village and that meant a certain measure of safety. Not permanent, not absolute, because there would be missions that would take her away from it again, but it was hard to imagine being attacked by anything worse than errant insect life in the halls that had been familiar to her since childhood. She slept easier that night than she had in weeks, even though she found the silence a little unnerving after having shared a room with so many others for so long. Kill your heroes. She dropped off her remaining Kippeo dresses to be cut down and freshly tailored early the next morning, then spent the next several hours finding a perfect, shorter but not too short overskirt to wear over her shorts, as well as tall boots to protect her much-abused shins. Running laps in the academy yard hadn't really prepared her for the reality of running briars, which Pakun insisted built dexterity. Once she saw the price of a good pair, she was glad for the latest addition to her bank account, because she had one last stop even when she'd accomplished all the shopping she meant to do that day. Clutching the paper that contained directions in Kakashi-sensei's surprisingly neat handwriting, Sakura navigated streets slightly more unfamiliar to her. Many of the smaller retailers of shinobi goods and specialized services didn't even allow academy students inside, and with the ongoing Cold War between Ino and herself, there hadn't been much reason to window shop alone. But she finally reached her destination, shifting her packages uncomfortably and reflecting that it might have been wiser to come here first. The storefront, such as it is, wasn't one that would have attracted her attention on its own. For one, there weren't windows with goods on display, just a sign above the door that identified it as being a place of business. And it wasn't a descriptive name, either. Just Hazekara, almost as plain as one that might have identified a residence. As Sakura cautiously opened the door, a bell jingled, but there was no immediate cry of welcome, which made her very hesitant about going further in. But there was plenty to see, even from where she lingered in front of the door. Lighted glass display cases housed fine leather work, while a more prosaic line of sheaths and pouches and complicated harness systems were on display along the walls. It wasn't a very large store, nor did it have much in the way of decoration. Utilitarian seemed to be the guiding principle. She wasn't made to wait very long, as a man emerged from a door in the back of the shop, sweeping aside the unadorned blue Norin. He was about half a head taller than Kakashi-sensei, with a head of disheveled ruddy brown hair, a square jaw with rough stubble on his chin, and a solid build. He was not what she'd expected. You look lost, kiddo, he observed. What can I do for you? His voice was just as rough as he looked. My sensei told me come here and follow your advice, she explained awkwardly. And who is your sensei? Hey, take Kakashi. His eyes widened faintly in recognition, then his face settled into less neutral lines. As they were pleased lines, it made him slightly less intimidating. Ah. Did more work with his father than Kakashi, but alright. Show me what you've got. Sakura blinked at his directness, before glancing down at her bags and, coming to a quick decision, leaning them against one of the display cases. She kept only one with her. She'd carried it out of the house this morning and kept it close to her all day, as the knives she'd brought with her out of Wave were too long to fit in her usual kit. She'd wrapped them in an old towel to keep them from destroying the bag, and as her fingers brushed over the cold metal edges as she freed them, Sakura had to repress a shudder. But then they were swept out of her hand as the man, she supposed he must be Hasakura-san, looked them over. At his clearly dubious look at the discolored one, she said, Kakashi-sensei said it was probably mostly cosmetic. Not quite certain what to do with the empty bag, she laid it across her other things. And then shuffled them awkwardly as she waited for Hasakura-san to finish his inspection. I assume these hilts were wrapped. I can replace that, no problem. Nylon cording might be best, he murmured to himself. She nearly jumped back when he crouched suddenly, laying the knives to one side and fishing measuring tape, pad, and pencil from his pocket. Hold still, he said curtly, and Sakura, used to obeying instructions, did as she was told. You're displaying better judgment than most with these, he told her as he took measurements with a brisk, impersonal efficiency. You don't want anything longer than this, not unless you get significantly taller. And I wouldn't recommend anything with more curve. Why? She asked cautiously. He sat down his tools and took up her knives, flipping them deftly so that they were hilt up, then held them so that they were pressed against the outside of her thighs, something possible only because she'd shed her kunao pouches for the day's shopping trip. The tip of the blade came to just above her knee, while the hilt hit below the widest point of her hips. The thing about knives is that you can't keep them in your hands forever. So you've either got to seal them or sheath them, and the thing about scrolls is that they're a few seconds more work than having them in your hand. Once you get to swords and bigger things, you sometimes get fools convinced that bigger is better and you end up having to sheath them on your back. And that's bad. As a samurai in armor? Maybe not, depending on how fast you can get that thing off your back, and here's to hoping your opponent waits for you to do it. As a shinobi? Your spine bends. That blade won't. And if you aren't using chakra, it's going to be secured at 2 points, top and bottom. Imagine trying to do a forward roll like that. So you lose a lot of flexibility. Same thing with a horizontal sheath at the waist. You have that overhang, which will catch on things when you least want it to. But these are just about perfect. See how neatly they set flush without overlapping anywhere you need to bend? That's what you want. I can make you a rig for these, no problem. Integrated kunao and shuriken storage too. He quoted her a price that was actually lower than she was expecting, and he must have read her surprise in her features. His hand came down on a knee and he let out a gusty sigh as he shoved himself to his feet. I'm selling you your everyday rig, not the one you'd wear while guarding the daimyo. It's not going to be hand-tooled leather. In fact, it's not going to be any kind of leather. I don't recommend leather for field use, even though I'll make exceptions if you're doing guard duty somewhere where you need to impress some nobles. Leather makes you sweat, for one, and it's hard to maintain for another. If you don't watch, it'll mold and it'll make your blades rust. I use nylon, which is much faster and easier to work, though I'll reinforce where the tip rests and the lip of the sheath. And it's easy for you to clean, too. It will wear out, because you ninja are hell on your equipment regardless on how rugged I make it, so I get a lot of repeat customers. No point in driving them away by charging more than fair price. So, you in, kiddo? Because if you say yes now, I can have them done in time to test out before the exams. Exams? Sakura asked blankly. Chunin exams, Hasakura-san explained. I figured that'd be the reason Kakashi was sending you here alone, rather than bringing you here in his own damn time. So, yes, or no? The answer, of course, was yes. Check the description for the links to the author.